I had a major spinal surgery. Before they wheeled me into the operating room, my 4 children stood around my bed and promised they would take turns staying with me. Day 1 passed with no visitors. Day 2 brought empty silence. By day 15, the nurse gently asked if I even had a family to call. I discharged myself, paid the bill, and ordered a private car. But the real heartbreak was not the empty hospital room. It was what I found when the driver pulled up to my house. A massive estate sale sign sat on my front lawn, and my children were inside dividing up my life. The sharp pain in my lower back radiated down my legs with every breath I took. Lumbar spinal fusion is not a kind procedure to a 68-year-old woman. The titanium screws in my spine felt cold and heavy as I slowly buttoned my blouse. I sat on the edge of the stiff hospital bed, staring at the stark white walls of my private recovery suite. The door clicked open. Nurse Kelly walked in holding my discharge papers. She had been the only constant presence in my life for the past 15 days. She looked at my packed overnight bag and then looked at the empty guest chair in the corner of the room. Her eyes held a mixture of professional courtesy and deep personal pity. "Mrs. Hayes," she said softly, "are you absolutely sure you do not have anyone we can call? I can arrange for social services to set up a medical transport. It is not safe for you to manage this transition completely alone." Her words hit me harder than the physical pain of the surgery. I smoothed the wrinkles on my wool trousers. I forced my spine straight despite the burning agony. I reached into my leather handbag and pulled out my black American Express Centurion card. I handed it to her with a steady hand. "No social services will be necessary, Kelly. Please charge the remaining out-of-pocket balance to this card. I have already arranged for a private car to take me home." Kelly glanced at the heavy black titanium card. She nodded, her expression shifting from pity to a quiet respect. "I will process this right away, Mrs. Hayes." When she left, I picked up my phone. The screen was glaringly bright. I opened the group chat labeled Family. I scrolled up to the messages from 15 days ago. The night before my surgery, the chat had been flooded with notifications. Thomas, my oldest son, had written, "Mom, do not worry about a thing. I am taking the first 3 night shifts. I will bring my laptop and work right from your room." Sarah, my oldest daughter, chimed in right after him. "I have the day shifts covered, Mom. I am bringing your favorite teas and those magazines you like." Richard, my second son, added a heart emoji. "I will take the weekend shifts. We have a whole schedule mapped out. We are not leaving you alone for a single minute." Emily, my youngest, sent a picture of a balloon bouquet. "We love you so much. You are going to be so spoiled with attention." I scrolled down past those enthusiastic lies. Day 1, nothing. Day 2, a generic automated text from Emily asking how the anesthesia wore off, which she never replied to when I answered. Day 3, silence. Day 4, silence. I spent 15 days staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor, waiting for the door to open. I spent 2 weeks learning how to walk again with a physical therapist, gritting my teeth through the agony, while the guest chair in my room remained completely empty. Not a single visit, not a single phone call, just absolute deafening silence. My phone buzzed with the notification from the Uber app. My driver was waiting at the main entrance. I picked up my overnight bag. Every step toward the elevator was a negotiation with pain, but my mind was crystal clear. I had spent 4 decades building a massive commercial real estate and wholesale nursery empire from the ground up. I knew how to survive in ruthless environments. I just never expected my own children to be the most ruthless people I would ever meet. The ride back to my home in the Chicago suburbs took 45 minutes. The driver was a polite man who kept the temperature comfortable and the music low. I watched the familiar wealthy neighborhoods roll by. Large brick manors, manicured lawns, tall oak trees lining the streets. I had provided a life of absolute privilege for my children. Private schools, debt-free college degrees, down payments for their first homes. I gave them everything, hoping it would build a foundation of love and loyalty. I was a fool. The black SUV turned onto my street. We approached my property, a $3 million red brick estate sitting on 2 acres of pristine land. But as the driver slowed down, my breath caught in my throat. Planted firmly in the center of my perfectly manicured front lawn was a massive bright yellow sign. Estate sale. Everything must go. I stared at the bold black letters. My heart pounded against my ribs. An estate sale. You only hold an estate sale when someone has died or when they are never coming back. The driver pulled into the circular driveway. He parked behind Thomas's luxury sedan and Sarah's new SUV. I thanked the driver, tipped him generously in cash, and asked him to leave my bag on the porch. I waited until his taillights disappeared down the street before I approached my own front door. I did not use my key. The front door was already unlocked, standing slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly. The heavy oak door moved without a sound. I stepped into the grand foyer. The house smelled of expensive French champagne and greed. I walked silently toward the living room, my rubber-soled shoes making no noise against the hardwood floor. I stopped just out of sight behind the large marble pillar near the entryway. The scene unfolding in my living room made the surgical pain in my back feel like nothing. My 4 children were gathered around the large mahogany coffee table. Greg, Sarah's husband, was standing by the fireplace. He was holding a bottle of my vintage crystal champagne, pouring it generously into my imported crystal flutes. This piece alone should fetch at least $10,000 at the auction tomorrow. Richard was holding a delicate antique silver clock that my late husband had given me for our 20th anniversary. He tossed it casually into a padded cardboard box at his feet. Emily was standing by the large mirror, clasping my favorite pearl necklace around her own neck. It looks better on me anyway. She admired her reflection. Mom never wore it right. She always paired it with those boring cardigans. Thomas took a sip of his champagne. He checked his watch. The state facility confirmed they have a bed opening up by the end of the week. It is a Medicaid-funded place, so it will not cost us a dime from the estate. Sarah laughed. A sharp, cruel sound. Did you see the brochure for that place? It looks like a prison block, but it is perfectly secure for dementia patients. And once Richard finalizes the legal paperwork tonight, we can legally transfer her straight from the hospital discharged to that facility. Greg chimed in, leaning against the mantel. Are you sure she is not going to put up a fight? Richard scoffed. He tossed another antique into his box. Fight with what? She has been heavily medicated for 2 weeks. She sounded completely out of it the one time I let her call go to voicemail. We just tell the doctors her cognitive decline accelerated due to the anesthesia. It happens to old people all the time. By the time she realizes what is happening, the house will be sold, the company assets will be liquidated, and she will be locked in a ward where they take away her phone. I stood behind the pillar listening to the people I gave birth to casually plot my total destruction. They were not just stealing my things, they were erasing me. They had left me alone in the hospital not out of laziness but out of strategy. They wanted me weak, isolated, and desperate. They wanted to strip me of my wealth, trap me in a miserable state, run nursing home, and divide my life's work while I was still breathing. A hot, terrifying anger flooded my veins. It burned away the haze of the pain medication. It sharpened my vision. I could have stepped out from behind the pillar and screamed. I could have ordered them out of my house. I could have called the police for trespassing and theft. But 40 years in business taught me one golden rule. Never interrupt your enemies when they are making a mistake, and never reveal your hand until the trap is fully set. They wanted a weak, confused old woman. I decided to give them an award-winning performance. I deliberately shifted my weight and kicked my overnight bag against the wooden door frame. It landed with a loud, heavy thud. The laughter in the living room died instantly. I heard the clinking of glass stop. I took 2 steps out from behind the pillar. I let my shoulders slump. I made my hands tremble violently. I widened my eyes and adopted an expression of utter bewilderment. I let my knees buckle just slightly, grabbing the edge of the hallway console table for support, knocking a decorative bowl to the floor. It shattered loudly. "Thomas," I called out. My voice was intentionally frail, high-pitched and trembling. "Thomas, where am I? Why are there strangers in my house?" The panic in the living room was immediate and absolute. "Mom," Thomas shouted. He dropped his champagne glass onto a coaster and rushed toward the foyer. Emily scrambled to yank the pearl necklace off her neck, shoving it deep into her designer handbag. Richard quickly kicked the cardboard box of stolen antiques behind the sofa out of sight. Sarah and Greg practically shoved each other out of the way to grab a blanket from the armchair. They swarmed into the hallway, their faces pale masks of fabricated shock and concern. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Thomas reached out and grabbed my arm, trying to steady me. "You are not supposed to be discharged until tomorrow. Why did the hospital not call us? We were just about to leave to come see you." I leaned heavily against him, letting my entire body weight sag as if I could barely stand. I looked at the 5 of them. Their eyes were wide with the terror of getting caught. "You promised to come," I whispered, letting a tear slip down my cheek. I waited. The nurses said I had to go. I took a taxi. But my back hurt so much. I do not remember how to get to my room. Sarah rushed forward and wrapped the blanket around my shoulders. "Oh, Mom, you poor thing. The hospital should have never let you leave alone. You are clearly confused from the medication. We are here now. We are right here." "We love you, Mom," Emily added, her voice dripping with that same fake sweetness from her text messages. "Let us get you to the sofa. You need to rest." They guided me into the living room. They cleared a spot on the sofa, treating me like I was made of fragile glass. I let them guide me. I let them think I had not seen the champagne glasses, or the missing clock, or the estate sale sign on the lawn. I sat down heavily, clutching the blanket, staring blankly at the wall. They exchanged relieved glances over my head. They thought I was completely broken. They thought I was exactly the easy, senile target they needed me to be. They had no idea that they had just declared war on the wrong woman. And they had no idea that I was going to let them dig their own financial graves before I buried them in it. The soft cushions of my living room sofa swallowed my aching body as Sarah gently lowered me down. She tucked a cashmere throw over my legs with exaggerated care, playing the role of the devoted daughter to absolute perfection. I kept my eyes half closed, letting my head loll against the backrest. I let out a shallow, shaky breath. The room was thick with the smell of my stolen champagne and their unspoken anticipation. Richard stepped forward. My second son always moved like a shark, sensing blood in the water. He was a corporate defense attorney in downtown Chicago, a man who made a lucrative living finding loopholes for people who deserved prison. He knelt right beside the sofa. He smelled of expensive single malt scotch and cheap cologne. "Mom," he began, his voice dropping into a soothing, hypnotic rhythm designed to disarm the vulnerable. "We are all so incredibly worried about you. Seeing you collapse just now, it breaks our hearts. You are clearly in no condition to deal with the stress of the outside world right now." I blinked at him slowly, forcing my lower lip to tremble. "I am just so tired, Richard. The surgery took everything out of me." "Exactly," Thomas chimed in, stepping up right behind his brother. "You need to focus entirely on resting. But the world does not stop spinning just because you are in pain, Mom. The business needs leadership." There it was, the pivot, the real reason they had gathered like vultures in my living room. For 40 years, I had built the Hayes Botanical Group from a single roadside greenhouse into a sprawling empire. I owned 70 commercial nursery centers across the Midwest. I supplied major retail chains, city parks, and corporate campuses. But the real wealth, the wealth they were actually drooling over, was the land. I owned the prime real estate beneath every single one of those nurseries, outright free and clear of any mortgages. My children had never worked a single day in the dirt, but they felt entirely entitled to the harvest. Richard pulled a thick stack of stapled papers from the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He smoothed it out on the glass coffee table right in front of me. "Mom, the executive board has been calling us nonstop." Richard lied without missing a beat. "The suppliers are getting anxious. We cannot let your legacy crumble while you are trapped in a hospital bed or a recovery facility. We need to step in and handle the day-to-day operations, just temporarily, of course, until you are back on your feet." I looked down at the document. My eyesight was perfectly fine, but I squinted hard, pretending I could not read the bold print at the top of the page. It was a full, durable power of attorney. It was not temporary. It was not limited to business decisions. The document Richard had drafted would grant him total and immediate control over my bank accounts, my real estate portfolio, my medical directives, and my personal assets. With one signature, I would legally hand him the blade to slit my financial throat. "I need you to manage the nurseries," I whispered, letting a tear pool in the corner of my eye. "It is just so much responsibility for you boys." "We will share the burden," Sarah said quickly, leaning over to squeeze my shoulder. "We are your family, Mom. We will protect everything you built. Just sign the paperwork, and you can finally sleep." Richard unclipped a heavy silver Mont Blanc pen from his shirt pocket and pressed it into my palm. I let the heavy pen slip right through my fingers and clatter onto the hardwood floor. "Oh, my clumsy hands," I gasped, rubbing my wrist as if my joints were failing me. "I am so sorry, Richard. The nerve damage from the surgery makes everything feel so heavy." "Do not worry, Mom," Emily said, her voice tight with suppressed impatience. "Let me get it for you." No, I murmured, reaching with a trembling hand into my own leather purse, sitting on the sofa cushion beside me. "I have my own pen right here. It is lighter, easier for me to grip." I pulled out a slender, dark blue fountain pen. It looked entirely ordinary, a cheap piece of plastic I could have picked up at any pharmacy. I gripped it awkwardly, letting my hand shake as I hovered over the signature line on the final page of the legal document. I looked up at my 4 children. Their eyes were locked on the tip of my pen. They were barely breathing. The greed radiating from them was so intense it almost had a pulse. "Thank you," I whispered, letting my voice crack with manufactured emotion. "Thank you all for taking care of your poor mother." I pressed the pen to the paper and slowly, shakily signed my full legal name, Vivian Hayes. The moment the ink finished flowing, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The heavy blanket of fake sympathy evaporated. Richard snatched the document off the table so fast the paper nearly tore. He did not bother checking to see if I was comfortable. He did not offer to get me a glass of water. He simply folded the papers, shoved them back into his jacket pocket, and stood up straight. "Well," Richard said, his tone instantly shifting from a soothing murmur to a brisk, business-like clip, "I need to get this to a notary I know who owes me a favor. He will backdate the stamp. Thomas, you and Greg load those boxes into the SUV. We need to clear out of here before the estate liquidators arrive tomorrow morning to do the final inventory." Sarah grabbed her designer coat. "We will call you in a few days, Mom. Just stay on the sofa and wait for the transport van. They said they would be here by 5 to take you to the facility. They did not hug me goodbye. They did not say they loved me. They simply grabbed the boxes of my stolen antiques, marched out the front door, and left me completely alone in my own house. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them, echoing through the empty foyer. I sat in the silence for exactly 2 minutes. Then I threw the cashmere blanket off my legs. I sat up straight, rolling my shoulders back. The surgical pain was sharp, but my mind had never been sharper. I looked down at the cheap blue fountain pen resting in my palm and allowed myself a cold, hard smile. 40 years of navigating the ruthless world of commercial real estate development had taught me to always be prepared for ambushes. I had negotiated with cutthroat developers, hostile city councils, and greedy contractors. I learned very early on to always carry a vanishing ink pen for reviewing draft contracts. The ink flowing from that blue plastic barrel was a special chemical compound used by architects and drafters. It looked perfectly permanent on paper, but it reacted with the carbon dioxide in the air. In exactly 12 hours, my signature on Richard's masterfully drafted power of attorney would completely evaporate. The document would be a blank, legally useless piece of trash. But I knew a vanishing signature was only a temporary shield. My children had shown their true faces. They wanted me destitute and locked away in a state-run ward. I needed to know exactly how deep their conspiracy ran before I unleashed hell upon them. I did not have to wait long for the answers to come finding me. Midnight draped the house in absolute darkness. I was sitting in my home office nursing a cup of black tea, reviewing my private ledger by the light of a single desk lamp. I had disabled the security alarms, knowing the estate liquidators would not arrive until morning, assuming they even showed up at all once I made a few phone calls. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. I did not flinch. I just slowly reached for the heavy brass paperweight on my desk. The door handle turned with agonizing slowness. The heavy wooden door pushed open, and a tall, thin figure slipped into the room. The light from my desk lamp caught his pale face and the messy mop of brown hair falling over his glasses. It was Leo, my 19-year-old grandson, Thomas's only child. Leo stood frozen by the door, breathing heavily, clutching a silver iPad tightly against his chest. He was wearing a dark hoodie and jeans, looking like he had just run 5 miles through the freezing Chicago night. Leo was the outcast of his immediate family. Thomas despised him for wanting to study computer science instead of finance. Sarah mocked him for being introverted. But Leo had always been my favorite. While his father and aunts were busy begging me for cash to fund their country club lifestyles, Leo was the only one who used to ride his bicycle to my house just to sit on the porch and drink iced tea with me. He was the only one who actually listened to my stories about building the nurseries. Grandma Leo whispered, his voice cracking with panic. "Are you okay? I saw my dad's car leave hours ago. I ran all the way from the campus dorms." I placed the brass paperweight back on the desk. "Come in, sweetheart. Close the door behind you." He locked the door and rushed over to my desk. His eyes were wide behind his glasses, scanning my face for injuries. He looked at the medical brace visible beneath my blouse. "They told me you had severe complications. They told me you were completely senile from the anesthesia and had to be locked in a medical ward. Dad said I was not allowed to visit you because it would be too upsetting to see you like that." I reached out and took his cold, shaking hand. "Do I look senile to you, Leo?" He let out a breath that sounded like a sob. "You look like the boss." I smiled. "Tell me why you are here in the middle of the night." Leo pulled a chair close to my desk and sat down. He placed the iPad flat on the mahogany surface. "I knew something was wrong at Thanksgiving, Grandma. Dad and Uncle Richard kept going into the den and locking the door. They kept talking about offshore accounts and liquidating assets. So I did something bad. I slipped a network protocol tracker onto Dad's home router. It mirrors his devices. I can see his emails. I can hear his voice memos. My brilliant, underestimated grandson had hacked his own father. Leo tapped the screen of his iPad. He pulled up an audio file. "Grandma, they are not trying to run the nurseries for you. They are going to destroy everything you built." I downloaded this call between Dad and Uncle Richard from yesterday afternoon. "You need to hear this." He pressed play. The audio was crisp and clear. The voices of my two oldest sons filled my quiet office thick with greed and arrogance. Richard spoke first. "The foreign buyers are getting impatient, Thomas. We need the signature today. The moment we have the power of attorney, we execute the sale of the downtown commercial plots. The buyers are paying cash $10 million under market value for a fast close." Thomas replied, his voice a low, excited growl. "And the holding company in the Caymans is ready to receive the wire transfer. The moment the cash clears the border, it becomes untraceable. What about the nursery supply chain?" "We declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy on the nursery side immediately," Richard said with a cold laugh. "We drain the operating funds to pay ourselves exorbitant consulting fees, default on all the supplier invoices, and let the bank foreclose on the greenhouses. The company dies, the employees get laid off, and we walk away with $40 million in clean, untraceable cash." Sarah's voice suddenly crackled through the speaker, indicating she had been on a conference line with them. "Just make sure her personal accounts are completely drained before she passes. If the estate taxes trigger, it will eat into our margins. The state facility will seize whatever is left in her checking account to cover her daily care, so we need to zero it out by Friday." The audio recording clicked off. The silence in my office was suffocating. I sat perfectly still, processing the sheer magnitude of their betrayal. They were not just stealing my money, they were going to burn my life's work to the ground. They were going to bankrupt the company, destroy the livelihoods of the 500 employees who had worked for me for decades, and leave a trail of ruined suppliers in their wake. They were going to funnel my legacy to an offshore account and leave me to rot in a miserable room until I died. I looked at Leo. Tears were streaming freely behind his glasses. He looked horrified, ashamed of the blood running through his own veins. "I am so sorry, Grandma," he whispered, wiping his face with the sleeve of his hoodie. "They are monsters. What do we do? Should I call the police? I have the audio. I have the emails." I looked at the black screen of the iPad. The pain in my spine had completely faded into the background, replaced by a cold, calculating energy that I had not felt since my early days in the cutthroat property markets. Calling the police right now would be a mistake. It would only result in an attempted fraud charge. Richard was a slippery lawyer. He would claim the audio was out of context. He would tie it up in court for years while they found new ways to hide their assets. "No, Leo," I said softly, my voice steady as stone. "We do not call the police, not yet." Leo looked confused. "But they have your signature. They are going to sell the land tomorrow morning." I smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile. They think they have my signature, but in a few hours they will be standing in front of a bank manager with a blank piece of paper. They think they have the keys to my kingdom. I stood up slowly, leaning my hands on the solid mahogany desk. "We are not going to stop them from trying to steal the empire, Leo. We are going to let them open the door. We are going to let them step inside, and then we are going to lock them in the burning building." I reached for my phone and dialed a number in Zurich, Switzerland. It was time to show my children why I was the one who built the empire and why they were completely unqualified to steal it. Morning light crept through the heavy, soundproof velvet curtains of my master bedroom, casting long, pale shadows across the Persian rug. The digital clock on my mahogany nightstand read 7 in the morning. Downstairs, the sprawling $3 million estate was entirely silent. My 4 children were likely sleeping off their stolen champagne celebration, completely convinced that their mother was heavily sedated, mentally compromised, and securely out of the way. I sat up in bed. The titanium screws in my fused lumbar spine sent a sharp, brilliant wave of protest through my nerve endings, but I pushed through the burning sensation. I reached over and locked my bedroom door with a solid, satisfying click. I opened the false bottom of my nightstand drawer and pulled out a secondary encrypted smartphone. I did not use my primary device for this kind of business. I knew Richard was a paranoid corporate attorney who would absolutely check my call logs and data usage if he ever got his hands on my unlocked phone. I dialed a highly secure international number. The line rang twice before a crisp, impeccably professional voice answered from Zurich, Switzerland. "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes," Henrik said. "I trust your spinal procedure was a success." "The physical surgery went perfectly," Henrik replied, keeping my voice low and measured. "But we have a rather severe infestation back home. My children have officially made their move. They believe they have secured a full power of attorney and are planning to liquidate the domestic operating company today." A soft, knowing chuckle echoed over the encrypted line. "I assume they are completely unaware of the corporate restructuring we finalized last month." "They are utterly blind to it," I said, allowing myself a tight, dangerous smile. Before I ever went under the knife, I had anticipated that a major medical vulnerability might tempt the greedy, impatient elements of my family. So I spent weeks working quietly with Henrik to gut the very empire my children thought they were inheriting. In the ruthless world of American commercial real estate, you never keep your valuable assets and your operational liabilities in the same basket. For decades, the Hayes Botanical Group had operated as a single massive entity, but 30 days prior to my hospital admission, I legally divided my entire empire. I transferred the property deeds to all 70 prime commercial real estate plots into a blind, offshore, irrevocable trust. That specific type of trust was completely shielded from any domestic power of attorney. It was an ironclad legal fortress that my children could not touch, alter, or access without my explicit notarized consent given in person. The domestic company, the LLC, that Richard and Thomas currently thought they controlled, had been quietly stripped of all actual land value. It was reduced to a mere operating shell. But an operating shell still needs heavy machinery to run, and massive agricultural infrastructure is incredibly expensive to maintain. "Henrik," I said, staring out the window at the morning frost gathering on the oak trees, "confirm the current status of the equipment leases and the vendor credit lines held by the domestic LLC. The $8 million commercial loan for the industrial tractors, the automated climate control systems, and the heavy transport fleets is entirely isolated within that domestic operating company." Henrik confirmed the sound of keyboard typing clicking in the background. "The debt is secured only by the active operational revenue of the nurseries. The contracts possess very aggressive default triggers. If they attempt to halt standard operations, lay off the workforce, or sell the shell company without lender approval, that massive debt will immediately accelerate and become due in full within 48 hours. Excellent. Prepare the legal default notices, Henrik. I want the lenders ready to strike the very second my boys violate the operational covenants." I ended the call and set the phone down on the mattress. My children thought they had just hijacked a $40 million golden goose. They had absolutely no idea they had actually stolen a ticking time bomb strapped to an $8 million anvil. By seizing control of the domestic LLC, they had taken ownership of a mountain of toxic debt without acquiring a single square inch of the valuable real estate that actually generated the wealth. I poured myself a cup of Earl Grey tea from the thermal carafe Leo had sneaked into my room the night before. I picked up my iPad and opened the highly secure application my grandson had installed for me. Leo was a quiet, unassuming genius. Knowing his father and uncles would likely try to take over the corporate headquarters the moment I was incapacitated, Leo had completely bypassed the building's standard security system. He had wired a series of hidden micro-cameras directly into the executive suite of the Hayes Botanical Group. I tapped the screen. The high-definition live feed flickered to life. I watched my own sprawling glass-walled CEO office materialize on the screen. I saw my massive mahogany desk, my leather executive chair, and the breathtaking panoramic view of the downtown Chicago skyline. Suddenly, the heavy double doors swung open. Thomas and Richard strutted into the room like conquering generals marching into a vanquished city. Thomas immediately dropped his weight into my chair, kicking his designer Italian loafers up onto the pristine surface of my desk. Richard paced the length of the room, loosening his silk tie and scrolling aggressively through his phone. "Call Robert in here," Richard barked at the empty room, pressing the intercom button on my phone console. "We need to clear out the senior staff before we finalize the liquidation agreements with the foreign buyers. Anyone loyal to Mom will just ask too many questions and slow down the asset transfer." A moment later, Robert stepped into the frame. Robert had been my chief operating officer for 15 years. He was a brilliant, dedicated, fiercely loyal man who had helped me navigate 2 economic recessions. He looked completely exhausted, clutching a thick stack of morning production reports against his chest. "You wanted to see me?" Thomas Robert asked, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. "Where is your mother? The hospital administration said she was discharged yesterday, but she is not answering her private cell phone." Thomas waved a hand dismissively, not even bothering to look up from my computer monitor. "She had a severe cognitive break. She is resting at home under strict medical supervision. Richard and I are taking over as acting managing directors, using our legal power of attorney. Effective immediately, your position is eliminated, Robert. Clear out your desk by noon and have security escort you out of the building." Robert stared at them, absolutely stunned by the callousness of the dismissal. "You cannot do that. We are in the exact middle of the spring distribution cycle. If you halt our logistical operations now, we will breach our biggest retail contracts. You will completely tank the company revenue." "That is exactly the point," Robert Richards sneered with a cold, arrogant laugh. "We do not care about selling fertilizer and potted plants. We are selling the dirt underneath the buildings to a foreign developer. Now get out before I call the police and have you arrested for corporate trespassing." I watched my loyal colleague leave the room, his shoulders slumped in defeat. A fierce flare of protective anger sparked in my chest. I knew Robert would be heavily compensated and immediately reinstated once I reclaimed my throne. But right now the boys needed to feel completely invincible. Invincible men always make the most fatal, irreversible mistakes. Richard pulled a thick stack of legal contracts from his leather briefcase and slapped them onto my desk. "The foreign buyers are demanding clear title on the agricultural equipment before they wire the cash for the company acquisition. The commercial lender is refusing to authorize the transfer without updated collateral signatures on the bridge loan." Thomas scoffed, rubbing his temples. "Just sign Mom's name. You have the power of attorney. We can push it through the title company this afternoon." "The power of attorney does not cover the supplemental bridge loan required to clear the heavy equipment liens," Richard explained, his voice tight with growing frustration. "The bank wants a direct physical signature from the company owner. But if I try to get Mom to sign this right now, she might actually have a moment of clarity and read the fine print. I am just going to forge it. It does not matter. Once the foreign cash clears, we pay off the bridge loan and nobody will ever look closely at the underlying paperwork." I leaned closer to the iPad screen, holding my breath. Richard took out a pen and hastily scrawled a flawless forgery of my signature onto the primary dotted line. He had clearly been practicing my handwriting for years, but he did not stop there. "The bank requires a personal guarantor to back the bridge loan during the transfer period," Richard said, flipping to the final heavily worded page of the contract. "They will not accept Mom's forged signature alone for a liability transition this massive. The risk department needs active solvent stakeholders to sign off on the debt." Thomas rolled his eyes, utterly blinded by the prospect of instant wealth. He grabbed the pen right out of his brother's hand. "Who cares about a temporary bank technicality? We are about to be $40 million richer by Friday. I will sign the damn thing." I watched in absolute mesmerized silence as my eldest son confidently signed his legal name on the personal guarantor line of a high-interest $8 million commercial debt contract. He handed the pen back to Richard, who eagerly signed his own name right below his brother's signature. They smiled broadly at each other, bumping their fists in a grotesque, arrogant display of premature victory. I slowly set my teacup down on the nightstand. I had to press both of my hands firmly against my mouth to muffle the dark, echoing laugh that bubbled up from deep within my chest. By filling out that specific personal guarantor section, Thomas and Richard had just legally bound themselves directly to the toxic debt of the shell company. They had voluntarily bypassed the corporate liability shield entirely. Without realizing it, they had just pledged their own luxury homes, their personal investment portfolios, and their future earnings as collateral for an $8 million loan tied to a company that owned absolutely no real estate. They thought they were simply signing the final paperwork to steal my massive empire. They had actually just signed their own inescapable financial death warrants, and they had done it all on high-definition time-stamped video. The blinding theatrical spotlights of Grace Fellowship Community Church pierced right through my closed eyelids. I kept my head bowed, letting my chin rest weakly against the collar of my knitted sweater. The deafening bass of the worship band vibrated up through the rubber wheels of the hospital-grade transport chair my youngest daughter had strapped me into. Emily gripped the push handles of my wheelchair with white-knuckled intensity. She was positioning me exactly at the edge of the VIP seating area, perfectly angled to catch the ambient lighting from the massive LED screens behind the pulpit. For 40 years, I had navigated boardrooms and commercial real estate negotiations. I knew exactly how to read a room. This was not a house of worship. It was a high-production television set designed to extract maximum capital from a captive audience. And tonight I was the star prop in my daughter's pathetic, incredibly lucrative performance. Emily adjusted the ring light attached to her smartphone. She checked her reflection in the screen, smoothing down her conservative pastel-colored designer dress. She tapped a button to start a live broadcast to her hundreds of thousands of followers. Instantly, her face transformed. The harsh, impatient scowl she had worn in the car ride over completely vanished, replaced by a mask of profound manufactured tragedy. "Hi, guys," Emily whispered into the microphone, letting a single, perfectly timed tear slip down her cheek. "We are here at the annual Grace Fellowship Charity Gala. It has been such a difficult week for my family. As you can see, my beautiful mother is fighting the hardest battle of her life." She angled the camera down to capture my slumped, frail-looking body. I let my jaw go slack. I allowed a slight tremor to take over my left hand, which was resting visibly on my lap. I stared blankly at the polished concrete floor, playing the role of a woman whose mind had entirely abandoned her. "The doctors say the cognitive decline is moving faster than we ever prepared for." Emily continued, her voice hitching with fake grief. "But she always loved this church. She always believed in giving back. So tonight I am hosting a special charity drive in her honor to support the youth ministry. Please, if my mother's journey touches your heart, use the donation link pinned in the chat. Every dollar helps us build a legacy of love for her." I kept my vacant stare locked on the floor, but my mind was calculating every single variable. I knew for an absolute fact that Emily had not attended a Sunday service in over a decade. Her sudden devotion to the youth ministry was a calculated business move. A well-dressed church usher approached us holding a silver tray with refreshments. He offered a sympathetic smile, holding out a delicate china teacup filled with warm chamomile. Emily took it, pausing her live stream for a moment, and shoved the cup into my hands. "Just hold this and look peaceful for the photographer," Emily muttered under her breath, her tone cold and vicious. I took the saucer. I let my hand shake violently. I waited until the exact moment the event photographer approached to snap a candid picture of the devoted daughter caring for her dying mother. Then I let the teacup slip right through my fingers. The china shattered against the polished concrete with a sharp crash. Warm tea splashed across the toes of Emily's pristine designer heels. Emily let out a sharp gasp of pure rage, jumping back and nearly dropping her phone. The photographer quickly lowered his camera, looking incredibly uncomfortable. "Oh, Mom," Emily said through gritted teeth, forcing a strained smile for the onlookers while glaring daggers at me. "Look what you did. You are just so clumsy today." I let out a weak, confused whimper, shrinking back into the wheelchair as if I were frightened. The usher immediately rushed over with a stack of paper towels, dropping to his knees to clean up the broken ceramic shards. Emily was forced to bend down and wipe the tea off her expensive shoes. In her frustration, she placed her unlocked smartphone face up on the armrest of my wheelchair. I did not move my head. I simply shifted my eyes downward. Emily had the donation dashboard open on her screen. The custom link she was heavily promoting to her followers, and the church congregation, was not routing directly to the Grace Fellowship bank accounts. My eyes scanned the small gray text at the top of the payment gateway. The funds were processing through a third-party holding entity called Ember Digital Media. I recognized the name instantly. It was the private marketing firm Emily had established 2 years ago. I watched the live transaction ticker scrolling on her screen. $50, $100, $500. The money was pouring in from sympathetic viewers. And right below the total raised amount, I saw the automated distribution protocol. 50% of the funds were being retained by Ember Digital Media as a standard administrative processing fee before the remainder was forwarded to the church charity. She was embezzling from a church. My youngest daughter was using my fabricated terminal illness to siphon tens of thousands of dollars from well-meaning donors directly into her personal checking account. Emily snatched her phone off my armrest, completely unaware that I had just deciphered her entire fraudulent revenue stream. She wiped the last drop of tea from her shoe and sighed heavily. "This is impossible," Emily muttered to herself. "I cannot babysit her and network with the deep pockets in the VIP lounge at the same time." As if on cue, Greg materialized from the crowded sanctuary. My son-in-law looked terrible. His usually perfectly styled hair was disheveled. The knot of his silk tie was pulled loose, and a fine sheen of cold sweat coated his forehead. He practically shoved his way past a group of elderly choir members to reach us. "I will take her," Greg said, his voice tight and breathless. "You go do your networking thing, Emily. I will take Vivian somewhere quiet. The noise out here is clearly too much for her." Emily did not hesitate. She handed him the handles of the wheelchair. "Keep her out of sight. She is ruining my aesthetic." Greg spun the wheelchair around so fast the rubber tires squeaked against the floor. He pushed me away from the bright lights, away from the crowded sanctuary, and guided me down a long, dimly lit corridor that led toward the administrative offices. The heavy thumping of the worship band faded into a muffled throb behind us. The air back here was noticeably cooler, smelling of old paper and floor wax. He did not stop until we reached a completely deserted hallway near the rear emergency exit. He pushed my chair roughly into an alcove, cornering me between a heavy fire door and a towering stack of folding chairs. Greg stepped in front of me, blocking any route of escape. His breathing was heavy, ragged, and smelling of stale coffee and pure panic. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a folded legal document. His hands were shaking so badly that the thick parchment paper rattled. "Listen to me very carefully, Vivian," Greg whispered, leaning down until his face was mere inches from mine. I maintained my blank, vacant stare, dropping my chin slightly, as if I could barely comprehend his words. "You and I both know you are circling the drain," Greg continued, his voice cracking with a frantic, desperate energy. "Richard and Thomas are taking the big commercial plots. Sarah is getting the cash accounts. But I need the Lake Geneva property. I need that summer cabin, and I need it today." He unfolded the document and slapped it down onto my lap. It was a quitclaim deed, a legal instrument designed to instantly transfer the ownership of a property without any warranties or background checks. He was trying to force me to sign over the massive, sprawling waterfront cabin I had purchased 15 years ago. "I do not have time to wait for the whole estate to clear. Probate," Greg hissed, pulling a small black ink pad from his pocket. "The real estate market crushed me this quarter. I am over-leveraged on 3 commercial developments. The private lenders are calling my loans, Vivian. They are threatening to take my house. They are threatening to come after Sarah. If I do not hand them the deed to a clean, debt-free property by Monday morning, I am a dead man." I stared at the document on my lap. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. My children were not just greedy, they were entirely financially compromised. Greg was drowning in toxic debt from a burst real estate bubble. Emily was stealing charity money just to keep up her wealthy influencer facade. They were all suffocating under the weight of their own extravagant lifestyles. Their rush to dismantle my empire and declare me mentally incompetent was not just about upgrading their luxury cars. It was about pure, unadulterated survival. They needed cash immediately to plug the massive holes in their own sinking ships. Greg popped the lid off the ink pad. "I know your hands are shaking too much to hold a pen," Greg said, his eyes wild and dangerous in the dim light of the corridor. "So we are going to use your thumbprint. It is legally binding in this state if I have 2 witnesses sign off on it later. Give me your hand." He reached down and grabbed my right wrist. His grip was bruising, painful, lacking any shred of basic human decency. He was going to physically force my thumb into the ink pad and press it onto the transfer deed. I braced my leg against the footrest of the wheelchair. I prepared to drop the senile act entirely. I was about to drive the heel of my orthopedic shoe directly into his kneecap and scream for church security. But before I could tense my muscles, a sharp crashing sound echoed from the other end of the corridor. "Oh man, I am so incredibly sorry." Greg whipped his head around, dropping my wrist in shock. Leo was standing 5 feet away, looking absolutely mortified. He was carrying a small service tray with 2 glasses of red wine. He lurched forward, as if he had caught his shoe on the carpet seam. The tray tipped sharply, one glass shattering against the floor, while the other poured dark red wine directly across the front of Greg's expensive gray suit trousers. "What the hell is wrong with you, Leo?" Greg shouted, leaping backward and frantically slapping at the dark red stains spreading across his clothes. "I tripped on the carpet seam," Leo stammered, rushing forward with a handful of dry paper napkins. "I am so sorry, Uncle Greg. Here, let me help you wipe that off." Leo lunged forward intentionally, swiping a wine-soaked napkin directly across the quitclaim deed resting on my lap. The red liquid instantly saturated the thick parchment paper, bleeding through the legal text and turning the signature line into a soggy, ruined mess. Greg let out a roar of absolute despair. He snatched the ruined document off my lap, staring at the destroyed paper as if he had just watched his own life savings burn to ashes. "You stupid, clumsy idiot!" Greg screamed, his face turning an alarming shade of crimson. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" This was the only printed copy I had. "The notary is waiting in the parking lot." "I will go get you some wet paper towels from the bathroom," Leo said, his voice trembling with perfectly executed apologies. "Just stay right there." Leo turned and sprinted back down the hallway toward the sanctuary. Greg stood in the dim corridor, clutching the soggy, ruined deed in his trembling hands. The sheer terror in his eyes was unmistakable. I was a man who had just run out of time. He looked down at me, his chest heaving, but the fight had completely drained out of him. The document was destroyed. The thumbprint plan was ruined. He wiped a hand across his sweaty face, turned on his heel, and stormed away toward the exit doors, leaving a trail of red wine footprints on the carpet. I sat in the quiet alcove. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a clean tissue, calmly wiping a single drop of spilled juice off the armrest of my wheelchair. Leo had not tripped. He had followed us. He had watched the entire confrontation unfold from the shadows and intervened at the exact perfect second to neutralize the threat without breaking my cover. I leaned my head back against the transport chair and let out a long, silent breath. The revelation shifted my entire strategy. My children were acting out of absolute desperation. Desperate people make sloppy, irrational mistakes when they are cornered. The financial trap I had prepared with Henrik in Switzerland was going to hit them infinitely harder than I originally anticipated. When those heavy equipment loans accelerated and the shell company defaulted, they would not just lose my money. The shockwave would completely obliterate their fragile, over-leveraged lives. They thought they were pushing me into an early grave. They did not realize they had just strapped themselves to a sinking anchor, and I was going to gladly watch them drown. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Richard shouting downstairs. His voice rose through the floorboards with none of the polished restraint he used in courtrooms. I stayed in bed for several seconds listening. A cabinet door slammed. Thomas swore. Sarah demanded to know how a bank could reject a notarized document. Emily said something about calling the bank manager personally. I already knew what had happened. 12 hours had passed. The blue ink that formed my signature on Richard's power of attorney had vanished exactly as designed. I dressed slowly, fastening the medical brace around my healing spine, and walked downstairs with my aluminum cane. By the time I entered the living room, all 4 of my children were there. Richard stood beside the fireplace, gripping the power of attorney so tightly that the pages trembled. The signature line at the bottom was blank. Not faded, not smeared. Blank. The notary stamp remained, the printed clauses remained, and every predatory provision Richard had drafted remained. Only the one thing he needed to make the document useful had disappeared. "Mom," Richard said, forcing his voice down into a careful register when he saw me, "we have a little paperwork problem." I widened my eyes and stared at the pages as if I could not understand why everyone looked angry. "Paperwork," I repeated weakly. "The bank refused it," Thomas snapped. "They said the signature is invalid. They said there is no signature." Sarah shot him a warning look, then moved toward me with false softness. "Mom, sweetheart, do you remember signing something for Richard yesterday? Something that let us help with the company?" I pressed my fingers to my temple. Yesterday. Was yesterday the day with the tea, or was that Sunday? Richard's jaw tightened. It was not Sunday. I let confusion cloud my face. Then I looked at him as though I had only just recognized him. "Are you the nurse's son?" Emily muttered a curse under her breath. That was the instant I realized their strategy had changed. The power of attorney had failed, but their greed had not. They had tried to take my authority with a signature. Now they were going to try to take my authority by proving I no longer possessed a competent mind. Richard folded the useless document and slipped it into his briefcase. His composure returned with frightening speed. "Fine, Mom. Do not worry about any of this. We are going to have a doctor stop by this afternoon. Just a routine post-surgical evaluation. We want to make sure the medication is not causing any cognitive side effects." A psychiatrist, I thought. Not an orthopedic surgeon. Not my primary physician. They were no longer trying to manage my recovery. They were building a conservatorship file. I lowered myself onto the sofa and offered him a grateful smile. That would be nice. I have been forgetting so many things lately. The 4 of them exchanged a look above my head. It lasted less than a second, but it told me everything. My weakness was still the product they wanted to buy. When they moved into the kitchen to argue in whispers, I tapped twice against the side of my cane. That was the signal Leo and I had agreed upon the night before. He was somewhere in the house staying invisible. I did not know exactly where he would position himself, and I did not need to. I only needed him to understand that the next phase of their plan had begun. The psychiatrist arrived shortly after 3 in the afternoon. He came alone, carrying a black leather medical bag and a thin folder. He was in his late 50s, expensively dressed, with the smooth, detached expression of a man who had learned how to make bad news sound clinical. Richard met him at the door before I could see whether they shook hands. By the time the doctor entered the living room, Richard had already transformed back into the concerned son. "Doctor, thank you for coming on such short notice," Richard said. "We are terrified. Our mother's decline after anesthesia has been extremely rapid." The psychiatrist did not ask to speak with me privately. That told me almost as much as a confession. He sat in the armchair opposite the sofa and opened his folder. Thomas stood near the window. And Emily hovered by the doorway. Richard remained close enough to hear every answer. A legitimate cognitive assessment would have required far more care, context, and independence than this little family theater. This man had arrived with a conclusion already waiting at the bottom of the page. "Mrs. Hayes," the psychiatrist began, "can you tell me today's date?" I looked directly at the large brass calendar on the side table. I had changed it myself that morning. Then I deliberately gave him a date from several months earlier. His pen moved immediately. "And do you know where you are?" I glanced around my own living room at the paintings I had selected, the rug I had imported, the staircase I had paid to rebuild after a winter pipe burst 12 years ago. "Hospital," I whispered. Emily turned her face away to hide a smile. The psychiatrist wrote again. "Can you tell me who the current president is?" I gave him the name of a president from years earlier, then frowned as if I had frightened myself with the mistake. I began rubbing my hands together. I asked whether the surgery was happening tomorrow. I asked where my purse was while it sat directly beside me. Each wrong answer produced another quick mark on his page. Richard watched with growing satisfaction. The doctor leaned forward. "Mrs. Hayes, do you recognize the people in this room?" I stared at Thomas for a long moment. My eldest son held perfectly still. "That is my brother," I said. Thomas actually smiled. I turned toward Sarah. "You are the lady from the pharmacy." Sarah lowered her eyes and pressed her lips together, fighting laughter. Then I looked at the psychiatrist. I let my expression soften into sudden, overwhelming relief. I reached toward him with both hands. "There you are," I whispered. "I have been waiting for you." He paused, waiting for me. I called him by my late husband's name. The room went completely still. For one brief second, something old and painful passed through me. My husband had been dead for years, and using that private memory as part of this performance felt like pressing on a scar. But I did not allow the emotion to break my concentration. I let tears fill my eyes. I told the psychiatrist I had been afraid he would not come home. I asked why he looked older. I asked whether the children were still at school. The psychiatrist shifted in his chair, but his discomfort was not moral. It was professional excitement. He believed I was handing him exactly what he had been hired to document. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "I need you to stay calm. Do not leave me again," I pleaded. Richard stepped forward and placed a hand on my shoulder, performing tenderness for the doctor's benefit. "Mom, it is okay. We are all here." I recoiled from him as if I did not know him. "Do not touch me. Where is my husband?" The psychiatrist made another notation. Above the living room ceiling, a faint metallic tick sounded from the old ventilation register. Nobody else reacted. I knew exactly what it meant. Leo was in position. Our house had been renovated twice over the years, and a wide maintenance crawl space ran above the formal living room where the original ductwork had been replaced. Leo had discovered it as a child and used to hide there during family gatherings whenever Thomas became too demanding. Now the narrow passage had become the perfect observation point. Through the vent directly above the chandelier, he could see almost the entire room. More importantly, he could record it. The psychiatrist continued for another 20 minutes. He asked me to remember 3 simple words. I intentionally repeated only one. He asked me to draw a clock. I placed the numbers in the wrong positions and drew both hands pointing straight down. He asked me to subtract 7 from 100. I gave him an answer that would have embarrassed a first grader. When he requested my full legal name, I hesitated long enough for Richard to inhale sharply with pleasure. Finally, the doctor closed the folder. "Based on what I have observed today," he said, "I have serious concerns about Mrs. Hayes' capacity to make independent financial and medical decisions. The combination of post-operative cognitive decline, disorientation impaired, short-term recall, and failure to recognize immediate family is significant." Sarah clasped her hands dramatically. "What does that mean?" "It means," the psychiatrist replied, "that a formal guardianship or conservatorship petition would be medically supportable if these symptoms are persistent." Richard lowered his head as if the words devastated him. In reality, he was hiding triumph. "Would you be willing to put that in writing, doctor?" he asked. The psychiatrist looked at me, then at Richard. "I can prepare a preliminary capacity statement today." I began to cry. Not loudly, not theatrically, just enough. "Please do not send me away," I whispered. "I will remember better tomorrow." Emily stepped beside me and stroked my hair with a hand that had never touched me once during 15 days in the hospital. "Nobody is sending you away, Mom." The lie was so effortless that it almost impressed me. The psychiatrist rose. Richard walked him toward the foyer. Thomas followed. Sarah and Emily stayed behind with me, speaking in soothing voices while discussing me as though I were already absent. "If we file first thing tomorrow," Sarah whispered, "how long until the court freezes her authority?" Richard answered from the hallway. "With the medical declaration and evidence of immediate financial risk, I can request emergency temporary control." Emily crossed her arms. "Then we can sell the house." Sarah looked down at me. "And move her before she causes another problem." I allowed my chin to fall toward my chest. Their plan was no longer hidden. They intended to convert a purchased medical opinion into legal control over my body, my home, and every asset they still believed I owned. Several minutes later, Sarah and Emily went upstairs to search through my bedroom for insurance records. Thomas stepped outside to take a phone call. I remained on the sofa, apparently exhausted. From the foyer came the low murmur of Richard's voice. I kept my breathing slow. The psychiatrist had not left. Their footsteps moved toward the small library beside the front entrance. The pocket door slid nearly closed, leaving only a thin strip of light. I could not hear every word from the sofa, but I did not need to. Leo was directly above that section of the house. The old maintenance crawl space continued across the ceiling. I heard Richard say, "You understand how urgent this is." The psychiatrist replied too softly for me to catch the full sentence. Then came the unmistakable sound of paper being handled. A thick envelope. A moment later, Richard's voice became clearer. "This covers the consultation and the expedited report. The language needs to be strong enough for emergency conservatorship. Severe cognitive impairment, immediate risk, inability to manage property. Do not soften it." The psychiatrist said, "I will document what I observed." "What you observed," Richard replied, "is exactly what we discussed." Silence. Then the envelope changed hands. I closed my eyes. Above them, Leo's camera was recording everything. The psychiatrist finally left through the front door. Richard remained in the library making calls. I waited until I heard him go upstairs before I slowly stood from the sofa and walked toward my home office. The door opened before I reached it. Leo slipped inside from the service hallway. Dust streaked the shoulders of his black hoodie. A faint red mark crossed one cheek where he had pressed against a metal duct. He looked furious. "Grandma," he whispered, "I got it." He raised his phone. The recording was almost perfect. The first section showed the psychiatrist conducting the evaluation while my children supplied their rehearsed concern from the edges of the frame. The second section was even better. Through the vent above the library, the camera had captured Richard opening his briefcase, removing a thick envelope of cash, and pressing it into the psychiatrist's hand. The audio captured Richard demanding specific wording for an emergency conservatorship petition. Leo stared at me. "They paid him to say you have dementia." "Yes. We can destroy them with this." "Not yet," I said. His expression tightened. "Grandma, they are going to file with the court, and we will be ready for that. But this is no longer just a family dispute over money. They have now manufactured medical evidence to strip an adult of her civil rights. Richard has attached his legal career to a bribed medical opinion. Every step they take makes the evidence cleaner." Leo looked back at the video. "So we keep recording?" "We keep everything," I replied. The doctor's cash envelope, the forged signatures, Emily's charity diversion, your father's offshore messages. Every lie needs its own file, its own timestamp, and its own chain of proof. I walked to the desk and unlocked the false drawer containing my encrypted phone. There was one person I trusted to decide when the evidence was strong enough. A man my late husband had trusted with the ugliest corporate wars of his career. I typed a short message to William Sterling. "The arsenal is ready. Meet me tonight." Then I looked at Leo. My children believed they had just purchased a doctor's permission to erase me. They had no idea that the diagnosis they bought had become another weapon in my hands. The grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway chimed twice, its deep resonance echoing through the silent house. I sat on the edge of my bed, fully dressed in dark trousers and a heavy cashmere coat. The surgical brace wrapped tightly around my torso was a constant throbbing reminder of my physical vulnerability, but my mind was operating with a cold, absolute clarity. I checked the screen of my secondary phone. A A single message glowed brightly in the dark. "The car is waiting at the service gate." I slipped out of my bedroom, moving with deliberate caution. Leo had temporarily disabled the interior motion sensors on the ground floor, granting me a 10-minute window to exit the property without triggering the alarms on Richard's phone. I walked through the darkened kitchen, stepped out the back door, and felt the bitter chill of the Chicago night hit my face. The frost crunched softly beneath my boots as I navigated the winding stone path toward the rear perimeter of the estate. Hidden in the deep shadows of the towering oak trees sat a massive black Lincoln Navigator. Its engine purred with a nearly silent hum. The heavy privacy curtains covering the rear windows completely obscured the interior. As I approached, the passenger side door swung open automatically. I climbed inside the warm air of the pristine cabin washing over me. The heavy door pulled shut behind me, sealing me inside a soundproof, luxurious vault. Sitting across from me in the plush leather captain's seat was William Sterling. William was not a family lawyer. He did not write standard wills or handle simple probate disputes. He was the most feared, ruthless corporate litigator in the entire state of Illinois. He was also my late husband's oldest, most trusted friend. They had built their respective empires side by side, sharing a mutual understanding that success required both vision and an utter lack of mercy for anyone who tried to stand in your way. William poured a measure of amber liquid from a crystal decanter into a heavy glass. He offered it to me. I declined with a shake of my head. He took a slow sip, his sharp silver eyes studying my face in the dim light of the cabin. "You look remarkably well for a woman who is supposedly suffering from terminal cognitive decline." William said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that commanded instant respect. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the encrypted tablet Leo had provided. I handed it across the small console table. "I am not the one whose mind has failed, William. My children, however, have completely lost their grip on reality." William took the tablet. He tapped the screen, bringing up the meticulously categorized folders Leo had organized. He spent the next 20 minutes in absolute silence. He listened to the high-definition audio recordings of Richard and Thomas plotting the fraudulent sale. He reviewed the high-resolution scans of the forged signatures on the heavy equipment contracts. He scrutinized the documents where my two eldest sons had foolishly listed themselves as personal guarantors for $8 million in toxic corporate debt. I watched his face carefully. William was a man who rarely showed emotion, but as he scrolled through the sheer volume of criminal evidence, the corners of his mouth slowly curled upward into a chilling, predatory smile. "This is truly spectacular," Vivian, William murmured, setting the tablet down on the leather console. "The sheer arrogance it takes to execute a hostile takeover this sloppily is breathtaking. Richard is a defense attorney. He should know better than to leave a digital trail this wide." "Greed makes people blind," I replied coldly. "They are rushing the cash by the end of the week. My grandson wants me to call the local police right now. He thinks we should have them arrested for domestic forgery and elder abuse before the sun comes up." William let out a harsh, dismissive scoff. He picked up his crystal glass and took another sip. "Calling the local authorities right now would be an amateur mistake. If you involve the city police, Richard will immediately invoke his legal network. He will argue that the power of attorney gave him broad administrative discretion. He will claim the audio recordings are completely out of context. At best, they get slapped with state-level fraud charges post-bail by noon and tie you up in civil litigation for the next 5 years. I leaned forward, my spine aching, but my attention entirely captured. "What is the alternative?" "We wait," William said softly, his eyes gleaming with malicious intelligence. "We sit quietly in the shadows and we give them exactly 3 more days to hang themselves." He tapped the screen of the tablet, bringing up the foreign buyer contract Richard had drafted. "Look at the payment routing protocol they established. They have instructed the buyer to wire $10 million through an out-of-state escrow account before routing the proceeds into a private shell entity in the Cayman Islands." I stared at the routing numbers, understanding beginning to dawn on me. "Right now," William explained, leaning closer, "they have committed state-level forgery and attempted theft. But the moment they execute that electronic transfer across state lines using the fraudulent documents, the scheme becomes federal wire fraud. If they continue routing the proceeds offshore, they also create a far more serious money laundering trail." William leaned back in his leather seat, adjusting his immaculate silk tie. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not treat a coordinated multi-million-dollar wire scheme as a private family dispute, Vivian. If we let them complete the interstate transfer, prosecutors can pursue the wire fraud, conspiracy, asset forfeiture, and every connected financial offense. We do not just stop the theft. We let them create the evidence that makes the case inescapable. A cold shiver ran down my arms, but it was not from the winter weather. It was the absolute thrill of perfect, inescapable justice. How do we ensure the trap snaps shut properly? I asked. William pulled a sleek laptop from a leather briefcase beside his seat. I am going to contact my liaisons at the federal level tomorrow morning. We will provide them with the offshore routing numbers your brilliant grandson uncovered. The authorities will quietly flag the destination accounts. When Richard and Thomas execute the wire transfer on Friday, the federal banking regulators will instantly freeze the funds in transit. The money will never reach the Caymans, and your sons will be holding the smoking gun on a federal crime. I looked out the tinted window of the SUV, staring at the dark silhouette of my sprawling house. I was agreeing to let my own children walk into a federal trap. Decades ago, I had rocked them to sleep in that very house. I had bandaged their scraped knees. Now I was handing them over to a system that would strip away their freedom for the rest of their natural lives. I waited for a wave of maternal guilt to hit me. It never came. They had chosen to leave me alone in a hospital bed. They had chosen to steal my legacy. They had chosen their fate. We wait 3 days, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Set the federal trap, William. While I was sitting in the secure luxury of William Sterling's vehicle, a completely different kind of revelation was unfolding inside the dark walls of my home. Leo was sitting cross-legged on the floor of my home office. The glow of his multiple laptop screens cast a pale blue light across his face, while his father and uncles were asleep in the guest rooms down the hall, secure in their arrogant belief that their plan was flawless. Leo was digging deeper into the encrypted partitions of Thomas's personal computer network. Leo had initially breached his father's files simply to find the offshore banking routes. But as he navigated through the hidden directories, he stumbled across a secondary set of ledgers. These documents had absolutely nothing to do with my botanical empire or the fraudulent sale of my commercial land. These files belonged to Thomas's private financial advisory firm. Thomas managed retirement portfolios for hundreds of middle-class clients. He handled pension funds for retired teachers, construction workers, and local municipal employees, people who had trusted him with their life savings. Leo opened a master spreadsheet labeled Internal Liquidity. His eyes widened as he compared the actual balance sheets against the automated statements Thomas had been mailing to his clients. The numbers did not match. In fact, the discrepancy was horrifying. Thomas had been systematically liquidating his clients' secure bonds and conservative mutual funds. He had been quietly draining their retirement accounts for over 3 years. Over $3 million of working-class pension money was completely missing. Leo's fingers flew across his keyboard, his heart pounding in his chest. He traced the outgoing wire transfers from the client-holding accounts. The money was not going into bad investments or failed startups. It was being funneled through a series of untraceable cryptocurrency tumblers, ultimately landing in the accounts of an illegal high-stakes offshore sports betting syndicate. Thomas was a crippling gambling addict. He had lost $3 million of stolen pension money on bad bets, illegal poker rings, and international sporting events. Leo felt physically sick. His father was not just a greedy opportunist trying to steal from his wealthy mother. He was a vicious predator who had destroyed the lives of hundreds of innocent, hardworking people just to feed a degenerate addiction. But the horror did not stop at the empty pension funds. Leo noticed a secure messaging application running silently in the background of his father's taskbar. The application utilized heavily encrypted, self-destructing text protocols. Leo quickly wrote a script to capture the incoming message cache before it purged. The messages were not from angry clients or banking regulators. They were from the enforcers of the illegal gambling syndicate. The text on the screen was brutal and direct. The messages detailed exactly how much money Thomas owed the syndicate in unpaid margin bets. The figure was staggering, $4 million, factoring in the exorbitant illegal interest rates. Leo read the final message, which had been delivered to his father just 2 days before my spinal surgery. "You are out of time, Thomas. You promised us the cash from the real estate sale by the end of this month. If the wire transfer does not hit our clearing accounts by Friday afternoon, we are done negotiating. We know where your wife works. We know which dormitory your son lives in. We will take our payment in blood. Do not test us." Leo stared at the screen, the blood draining completely from his face. The sudden rush to declare me legally incompetent, the frantic desperation to sell the commercial nurseries at $10 million under market value, the sheer recklessness of leaving a digital trail of forged documents. It all suddenly made terrifying sense. Thomas was not acting out of casual greed. He was acting out of pure, unadulterated terror. He was a dead man walking. The sale of my company was not meant to buy him a new yacht or fund a luxury vacation. It was the only thing standing between him and a violent, brutal execution at the hands of organized criminals. The door to my office clicked open. I stepped inside, having just returned from my clandestine meeting with William Sterling. The cold air from outside still clung to my heavy coat. I looked at my grandson. He was shaking, clutching his laptop tightly against his chest. He turned the screen toward me, his eyes filled with tears of absolute despair. Grandma Leo whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "Dad is not just stealing from you. He stole from everyone. He stole millions from his own clients. And if he does not get the money from your company by Friday, they are going to kill him. They threatened my mom. They threatened me." I walked slowly around the desk. I placed my hands on the edge of the wooden surface and looked down at the encrypted messages from the violent loan sharks. I looked at the ruined ledgers showing the drained pension funds of innocent teachers and retirees. A different kind of woman might have felt a surge of panic. A different mother might have felt the sudden, desperate urge to save her son from the violent consequences of his own actions. I could easily pay off the $4 million gambling debt. I had the liquid assets. I could save his life. But I looked at the names of the elderly clients he had defrauded. I thought about the people who had worked for 40 years only to have their security wiped out by a man who felt entirely entitled to their suffering. Thomas had shown no mercy to them. He had shown no mercy to me while I was lying in a hospital bed. I reached down and gently closed the lid of Leo's laptop. I looked at my grandson, offering him a calm, steady gaze. "Your father made a series of catastrophic choices." "Leo," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "He built a house of cards on the backs of innocent people, and he invited the wolves to his own door. We are not going to save him from the wolves." But Grandma Leo cried softly. "They will hurt him." I placed my hand gently on Leo's shoulder. "He will not be on the streets by Friday, sweetheart. By the time the syndicate realizes the money is not coming, your father will be sitting safely in federal custody for wire fraud. The prison walls will protect him from the people he owes money to, but nobody is going to protect him from the justice he deserves." I walked over to the window and looked out at the dark estate. The trap was set. The federal authorities were waiting. My children thought they were running a brilliant corporate heist. They did not realize they were actually sprinting desperately toward the edge of a sheer cliff, completely blind to the drop below. And I was going to gladly watch them fall. The crystal chandeliers of the grand dining room at the Sovereign cast a warm golden glow over the private corner booth. It was the most exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant in downtown Chicago, a place where dinner reservations usually required months of advance notice. My children, however, had simply bribed the managing host with $2,000 in cash to bump another party off the VIP list. They were in an extraordinarily generous mood. They felt invincible. I sat in the quiet, secure luxury of William Sterling's downtown law office, nursing a cup of Earl Grey tea. The heavy oak doors were locked. The room was soundproofed. Resting on the polished mahogany desk between us was a sleek laptop displaying a crystal-clear, high-definition video feed. Leo had managed to clone Richard's smartphone camera and microphone access earlier that afternoon. Now we were watching a live broadcast of my family celebrating their ultimate victory. They were toasting with bottles of ridiculously expensive Bordeaux wine, clinking their heavy crystal glasses together with aggressive enthusiasm. They were laughing so loudly that the other wealthy patrons in the restaurant were casting annoyed, judging glances in their direction. My children did not care. They had just successfully executed the signed contract to sell the domestic shell company for $10 million to a mysterious, aggressive foreign investment conglomerate. They thought they had just secured generational wealth. They had absolutely no idea that the mysterious foreign conglomerate purchasing the company was entirely controlled by my own offshore Swiss trust. I was secretly buying my own empty shell company just to string them along. But the sheer arrogance of my children was truly a spectacle to behold. They could not even wait the standard 48 hours for the international wire transfer to clear escrow. The burning, desperate greed inside them demanded immediate gratification. Richard had taken the signed $10 million acquisition contract straight to a predatory short-term shadow lender in the financial district. He used the pending sale as rock-solid collateral to secure a massive high-interest cash advance of $4 million. The lender had cheerfully wired the funds into a joint account that morning, knowing the full $10 million was scheduled to hit the bank by Friday. I watched the live video feed as Thomas aggressively cut into a rare, dry-aged steak. He was practically vibrating with adrenaline. "I picked up the Porsche 911 Turbo this afternoon," Thomas bragged, pointing his steak knife toward his brother. "I paid the dealership $150,000 in cash right up front. The dealer treated me like absolute royalty. I am driving it straight to the country club tomorrow morning to show those smug executives what real liquid wealth looks like." Sarah took a massive gulp of her red wine, her eyes gleaming with a manic, materialistic hunger. "Rick and I finally put down the non-refundable deposit on that 7-bedroom estate in Highland Park. The realtor tried to tell us there were other competitive offers on the table, so Greg just authorized a $500,000 cash wire to lock the sellers out of any other bids. We are closing on the house next week. We are officially moving out of that cramped suburban nightmare." Emily scoffed, busy tapping away on her latest smartphone. She was draped in a brand-new, wildly expensive designer jacket that still had the faint crease marks from the boutique shopping bag. "You guys are thinking way too small," Emily said, not looking up from her screen. "I just completely paid off all 5 of my maxed-out credit cards. Do you know how good it feels to zero out an $80,000 platinum card balance in one single click? I also just booked a first-class ticket to Dubai for next month. The content creation opportunities are going to be insane. My engagement metrics will absolutely double." Richard leaned back in the plush leather restaurant booth, swirling the dark red wine in his glass. He looked like a man who had just conquered the entire world. He was the architect of this grand illusion, the mastermind who believed he had outsmarted his own mother. "We earned this," Richard declared, a smug, self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face. "We suffered under her controlling grip for decades. We waited patiently while she hoarded all that prime real estate. We played the game, and now we are finally reaping the rewards. By Friday, the remaining $6 million clears the foreign escrow account, and we are completely financially untouchable." William Sterling sat across from me in his law office, watching the live feed with an expression of pure, refined disgust. He reached out and paused the video, freezing my children in a chaotic tableau of gluttony and pride. "It is genuinely fascinating to witness this level of profound stupidity," William murmured, shaking his head slowly. "They took out a $4 million cash advance with a shadow lender, utilizing an unclosed real estate contract as their only collateral. And they immediately spent the liquid cash on depreciating luxury assets, non-refundable real estate deposits, and unsecured consumer debt." I took a slow, methodical sip of my warm tea. The blend of bergamot and black tea leaves grounded me, keeping my focus sharp. "They are spending money that does not actually exist," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of any maternal pity. "They think the $10 million finish line is a guaranteed certainty. They have completely insulated themselves in their own arrogance." William opened a separate window on his laptop screen. He brought up a highly secure encrypted messaging portal, communicating directly with the wealth managers in Zurich. "The offshore trust is fully prepared," Vivian Williams said, his silver eyes locking onto mine with a cold professional intensity. "The acquisition attorneys have drafted the formal termination notice. We are claiming that a routine final-hour forensic audit has uncovered massive, previously undisclosed financial liabilities attached to the domestic shell company." I looked at the frozen image of my 4 children on the screen. I saw the pure, unfiltered greed radiating from their smiling faces. I thought about the desolate, empty hospital room where I had waited for 15 days. I thought about the terrifying moment I realized they genuinely wanted to lock me in a state-run dementia ward and throw away the key. "Pull the trigger, William," I commanded. "Collapse the foundation." William did not hesitate. He struck the enter key with a sharp, definitive click. In that exact fraction of a second, an automated, legally binding email was dispatched from Switzerland directly to Richard's corporate inbox, to the escrow holding company, and to the predatory shadow lender who had issued the $4 million cash advance. The formal notice declared the $10 million acquisition of the Hayes Botanical Group null and void. The foreign buyer was pulling out immediately, citing a breach of fiduciary transparency. We unpaused the live video feed from the Michelin-starred restaurant. My children were still laughing. Greg was ordering a decadent chocolate dessert for the table. Emily was adjusting the angle of her smartphone to capture the perfect lighting for a social media post. They were completely oblivious to the catastrophic financial avalanche that had just been unleashed upon them. The beauty of the trap was its absolute invisible silence. The moment the $10 million sale was officially canceled, the short-term bridge loan they had secured went into immediate catastrophic default. The shadow lender they had borrowed the $4 million from did not operate like a traditional patient bank. They had aggressive immediate clawback provisions written into the fine print of their cash advance agreements. Within minutes, automated banking protocols would freeze all of their newly bloated checking accounts. The $500,000 non-refundable deposit Sarah and Greg had wired for the Highland Park mansion was gone forever, surrendered to the sellers the moment the bridge loan defaulted. Thomas's pristine new Porsche 911, turbo purchased with fraudulent loan funds, was instantly flagged for priority repossession. But the default on this bridge loan was only the first blade of the guillotine. The moment the corporate sale collapsed, it triggered the secondary tripwire I had meticulously set up. William tapped his keyboard again, activating the legal mechanisms for the $8 million commercial equipment loan. Because Richard and Thomas had foolishly signed their own names as personal guarantors on the corporate debt, they had completely destroyed their legal liability shields. "I just authorized the commercial lenders to issue the formal demand letters," William noted, leaning back in his chair and watching the video feed with clinical fascination. "The $8 million debt has officially accelerated. Due to the breach of the operating covenants and the failed corporate sale, the entire balance is now due in full." I watched Richard on the screen. He was taking a bite of a delicate, beautifully plated appetizer. He chewed slowly, savoring the rich flavors of a meal he could no longer afford. By tomorrow morning, process servers would be knocking on their front doors. The commercial lenders would file emergency liens against Richard's downtown penthouse and Thomas's suburban estate. The shadow lender would begin aggressive asset seizures to recover the squandered $4 million cash advance. They had collectively tied themselves to $12 million in aggressive, immediately payable debt, and they possessed absolutely zero actual assets to leverage against it. The commercial land they thought they were selling was safe in my untouchable trust. The shell company they controlled was practically worthless. They were bankrupt, completely, utterly, irredeemably bankrupt. "Look at them," William murmured, his voice laced with a dark, chilling amusement. "They are sitting on the edge of an absolute financial apocalypse, and they are still arguing over the wine selection." On the screen, Thomas's phone suddenly vibrated against the white linen tablecloth. He glanced down casually, expecting a congratulatory text from a colleague or an update from his luxury car dealer. Instead, I watched his posture suddenly stiffen. The arrogant, relaxed slouch vanished from his shoulders. He picked up the phone, his brow furrowing in deep, profound confusion. "What is it?" Sarah asked, pausing with her wine glass halfway to her mouth. "You look like you just saw a ghost." Thomas did not answer. He was staring at the glowing screen, his mouth slightly open. His thumb frantically swiped down the display, refreshing his email inbox over and over again. "Richard," Thomas whispered, his voice suddenly stripped of all its commanding authority. It sounded thin, hollow, and absolutely terrified. "Richard, check your secure email, right now." Richard rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed by the interruption of his victory dinner. He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out his smartphone. He unlocked the screen. I watched the exact precise second my son realized his entire life had just ended. Richard's face drained of all color. His skin turned a sickly pale shade of ash. The hand holding the phone began to tremble so violently that the device rattled against his expensive wedding ring. He dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against the fine china plate. "The acquisition was just canceled." Richard choked out, gasping for air as if someone had just punched him directly in the chest. "The foreign buyers terminated the contract. They pulled out." "What do you mean they pulled out?" Greg shouted, leaning across the table, his face instantly flushing with panic. "We already spent the cash advance. I wired the deposit for the house. The money is gone." Emily dropped her phone onto the table. Her eyes darted wildly between her brothers. "But my credit cards. I paid them all off. I cannot reverse the payments. If the bridge loan defaults, they will drain my checking account." Richard was not listening to them. He was staring at a second email notification that had just popped onto his screen. It was the automated legal demand from the commercial equipment lender. "Oh my God," Richard whispered, pressing his hands against the sides of his head in sheer disbelief. "The equipment loan. The $8 million. The bank just accelerated the debt. They are calling the loan due." Thomas grabbed his brother by the collar of his suit jacket. What are you talking about? We guaranteed that loan personally. If they call the debt, they can take my house. They can take my investment portfolios. You told me it was just a technicality. You told me we were safe. The private dining room at the Michelin-starred restaurant descended into absolute vicious chaos. The polite, wealthy facade shattered instantly. They began screaming at each other. Greg accused Richard of incompetence. Sarah yelled at Thomas for signing the guarantor paperwork. Emily sat frozen in her chair, hyperventilating as she realized her luxurious influencer lifestyle was completely over. I sat quietly in the law office watching the spectacular, devastating collapse of my children's lives. I took another slow sip of my tea. The warmth of the beverage settled pleasantly in my chest. They are turning on each other already, William observed, closing the video feed application with a satisfying click. They will spend the next 10 years drowning in civil litigation and bankruptcy hearings. I stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of my coat. The physical pain in my back was entirely manageable now. I felt stronger than I had in years. Civil litigation is just the warm-up act, William, I said, walking toward the heavy oak door of the office. The financial ruin is just the consequence of their own stupidity. But tomorrow we deliver the consequences for their cruelty. Tomorrow we let the federal authorities step in. The heavy oak front door of my estate did not just open. It was violently shoved inward, slamming against the foyer wall with a deafening crash that rattled the crystal chandelier in the hallway. I was sitting quietly in my bedroom armchair, sipping a cup of warm water, fully dressed, and waiting. The chaotic symphony of panicked voices and stomping footsteps echoed up the grand staircase. My children had returned from their disastrous victory dinner, and the sheer desperation radiating from them was thick enough to choke on. I heard Richard barking orders, his voice completely stripped of its usual slick courtroom polish. It was the frantic, high-pitched tone of a cornered animal. Thomas was swearing loudly, kicking a decorative side table out of his way. I quickly set my cup down, grabbed my aluminum walking cane, and forced my shoulders to slump into a posture of frail, absolute confusion. My bedroom door flew open. Sarah and Emily marched inside, holding boxes of heavy-duty black plastic trash bags. They looked entirely unhinged. Sarah had smeared mascara underneath her eyes from crying all night. Emily looked pale and sickly, her designer dress deeply wrinkled. Richard and Thomas crowded into the doorway right behind them, their faces flushed with sweat and pure terror. "Mom, get up right now!" Richard commanded, his chest heaving as he marched toward my armchair. "We are moving you today." The medical transport van is idling in the driveway. I widened my eyes, letting my jaw tremble slightly. I gripped the armrests as if I were terrified. "Moving me where, Richard? I am not packed. My doctor said I need to rest in my own bed." "This is not your bed anymore," Thomas snapped, stepping into the room and wildly gesturing to his sisters. "Pack her clothes. Just grab whatever fits in the bags. Leave the jewelry and the expensive shoes. We need to auction those off this afternoon." Sarah ripped a black trash bag open with a loud plastic snap. She threw open my mahogany closet doors and began violently yanking my silk blouses, wool trousers, and cashmere sweaters right off their wooden hangers. She shoved my beautiful, tailored garments into the garbage bag like they were nothing but worthless rags. Emily marched over to my dresser, violently pulling the drawers open and scooping up handfuls of my undergarments, dumping them unceremoniously into a second plastic sack. "What are you doing?" I cried out, letting my voice crack perfectly into a weak, pathetic sob. "Please, Sarah, those are my favorite clothes. You are ruining them." "Shut up, Mom!" Sarah screamed, turning to glare at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "We do not have time for your senile whining today. We found an all-cash buyer who wants the property immediately. We are liquidating the estate by noon. You are going to a secure care facility where professionals can deal with your constant confusion." I knew exactly what was happening. The $10 million corporate sale had collapsed in spectacular fashion the night before. Their massive bridge loans were currently in catastrophic default. The shadow lenders were likely threatening to seize their personal bank accounts and their own luxury homes by the end of the business day. In a blind, frantic panic, my children were attempting a completely illegal, unauthorized fire sale of my primary residence just to generate enough raw cash to save their own skin. Thomas marched over and grabbed me roughly by the upper arm, hauling me up from the armchair. The sudden movement sent a genuine flare of pain through my healing spine, but I swallowed my gasp. "Let go of me," I pleaded weakly, leaning heavily on my aluminum cane. "Where are you taking me?" "You are going to Oak Creek Manor," Richard said, checking his watch with frantic urgency. "It is a highly secure facility. They have a specialized memory care ward. You will be perfectly comfortable there, and they take your state insurance, so it will not cost us a dime. I knew Oak Creek Manor. It was a bleak, miserable, underfunded warehouse located on the absolute outer edge of the county limit. It was notorious in local real estate circles for being a dumping ground for forgotten, impoverished seniors. It was the kind of place where underpaid staff heavily medicated the patients with chemical sedatives just to keep the hallways quiet. My children were tossing me into a pharmaceutical asylum so they could strip the copper wiring out of my house. "Please do not make me go there," I begged, letting thick tears spill over my eyelashes and run down my wrinkled cheeks. "I want to stay in my home. I will be good. I promise I will not be a burden." Emily scoffed, tossing a half-filled garbage bag onto the carpet. "You are already a burden. You ruined everything by holding onto this property for so long. Now walk downstairs before we have to physically carry you to the van." Thomas did not even give me the chance to walk under my own power. He kept his bruising grip on my arm and practically dragged me out of my bedroom. We moved down the grand staircase, my feet stumbling over the plush carpet. I looked at the walls of the house I had purchased decades ago. I looked at the family portraits hanging in the hallway displaying the smiling faces of the monsters who were currently treating me like a sack of unwanted medical waste. A rusted white commercial transport van was idling in my circular driveway. The company logo on the side was peeling. The driver was a bored-looking man in a cheap uniform, smoking a cigarette near the bumper. He opened the rear sliding door, revealing a dark vinyl interior that smelled strongly of industrial bleach and old stale air. Sarah and Emily threw my garbage bags of clothing roughly into the back of the van. Richard shoved a crumpled envelope containing my basic admission paperwork into the driver's hand. "Take her straight to the intake coordinator at Oak Creek," Richard ordered, handing the driver a wad of folded cash. "Do not let her out of the vehicle until you are safely inside the secured courtyard. She is highly confused and prone to wandering." The driver pocketed the cash with a completely indifferent nod. "Get in, lady," he mumbled, tossing his cigarette onto my pristine driveway. I stepped up into the dark, gloomy interior of the transport van. I found a seat on the cracked vinyl bench. Thomas slammed the heavy sliding door shut behind me, plunging the cabin into heavy shadow. Through the smudged, tinted glass of the rear window, I watched my 4 children standing on the front porch of my estate. They were already turning their backs on me. Richard was dialing his phone, likely calling a desperate real estate broker to list my house for a fraction of its actual worth. Sarah and Emily were rushing back inside to continue pillaging my jewelry boxes. They did not wave goodbye. They did not show a single ounce of remorse. They thought they had finally disposed of their biggest liability. The driver shifted the heavy van into gear. We rolled slowly down the driveway and turned onto the main road, leaving my beautiful brick estate far behind. For the first 5 minutes of the ride, I kept my head bowed and my shoulders slumped, just in case the driver was watching me through the rearview mirror. But the moment we merged onto the busy interstate highway, I slowly straightened my spine. I reached up and smoothly wiped the fake tears from my cheeks. The pathetic, trembling expression melted completely off my face, replaced by a mask of cold, absolute sovereignty. My breathing steadied. My heart rate slowed to a perfectly calm, rhythmic beat. The entire eviction had been a chaotic, brutal assault on my dignity, but it was exactly the strategic maneuver I needed them to make. By forcing me out of the house and physically surrendering me to a state facility, they believed I was completely neutralized. They thought I had no phone, no resources, and no allies. They were fully convinced that they had a clear runway to execute their fraudulent, desperate financial transactions over the next 48 hours. They were completely uninhibited, which meant they would walk directly into William Sterling's federal trap without checking a single blind spot. The drive to the outer county limits took nearly an hour. The wealthy, manicured suburbs slowly gave way to industrial parks, cracked pavement, and overgrown vacant lots. The transport van finally turned onto a deeply potholed street and approached the towering, stained concrete walls of Oak Creek Manor. The facility looked exactly like a minimum security prison. The windows were small and covered with thick metal safety grates. The sparse lawn was entirely dead brown and brittle under the gray morning sky. The driver pulled the van up to the main circular drop-off zone, bringing the vehicle to a rattling halt right in front of a pair of large sliding glass automatic doors. The driver cut the engine and slid his window down. "All right, we are here," he grunted, sliding out of his seat and opening my heavy side door. "Step out carefully. Go stand by those glass doors while I get your trash bags out of the back. The intake nurse is supposed to meet you in the lobby." I gripped the side of the door frame and stepped down onto the cracked concrete sidewalk. I held my aluminum cane loosely in my right hand. The driver immediately walked around to the rear doors of the van, completely turning his back on me to wrestle with the heavy plastic bags. I did not walk toward the sliding glass doors of the bleak, depressing nursing facility. I turned on my heel and walked briskly in the exact opposite direction. I moved with the smooth, commanding stride of a corporate chief executive. I rounded the sharp brick corner of the main building, stepping out of the drop-off zone and entirely out of the driver's line of sight. I walked down a narrow, shadowed access road that ran alongside the facility's massive industrial dumpster enclosures. Waiting for me at the very end of the access road, perfectly concealed in the deep shadows of the towering brick wall, was a gleaming, midnight black Lincoln Town Car. Its engine was running with a silent, powerful hum. The driver's side door opened. Leo stepped out onto the pavement. He was wearing a sharp, tailored black suit that made him look older, completely shedding his usual college dormitory attire. He looked like the brilliant corporate heir he was born to be. Leo opened the heavy rear passenger door for me. He offered a respectful, incredibly proud smile. "Right on schedule, Grandma," Leo said, his voice steady and calm. I stopped right beside the large, rusted industrial dumpster. I looked down at the aluminum walking cane I had been using as a pathetic prop for the past 2 days. I lifted my arm and tossed the metal stick directly into the garbage bin. It landed among the trash with a loud, hollow clatter. I stepped smoothly into the luxurious, warm interior of the Lincoln Town Car. The premium leather seats embraced my tired back. The cabin smelled of expensive polish and absolute freedom. Leo closed the door firmly behind me, sealing me inside the soundproof sanctuary, and quickly climbed into the driver's seat. He shifted the heavy car into gear, and we glided smoothly away from the miserable concrete facility, merging seamlessly into the anonymity of the city traffic. I leaned my head back against the soft leather headrest and let out a long, deeply satisfying breath. My children thought they had just buried me alive in a chemical prison. They thought I was a helpless, confused victim crying in a locked ward. In reality, I was a total ghost. I was completely untethered from their surveillance, backed by millions in offshore capital, armed with a mountain of federal criminal evidence and entirely invisible to their radar. "Take us to the downtown hotel suite," Leo, I commanded, looking out the tinted window at the passing city. "The federal deadline approaches. It is time to prepare for the final execution." The black Lincoln Town Car carried Leo and me away from Oak Creek Manor without attracting a second glance. 20 minutes later, the stained concrete walls of the state facility had disappeared behind us, replaced by the glass towers of downtown Chicago. My children believed I was sitting behind a locked door waiting for a sedative. In reality, I was entering the final command center of the war. We pulled into the private underground entrance of a 5-star hotel overlooking the river. Leo had reserved the suite through one of the trust's corporate accounts, so my name would never appear on the public guest registry. We took a service elevator to the top floor. When the doors opened, I stepped into a sprawling suite that looked less like a hotel room and more like a temporary intelligence office. 3 laptops sat open across the dining table. 2 external monitors displayed encrypted folders. A printer hummed beside neatly stacked binders. Leo had spent the previous night organizing every piece of evidence into separate packages, each labeled by date, source, and offense. William Sterling had insisted on preserving the original files and metadata so Richard could never dismiss them as edited family gossip. I removed my coat and lowered myself carefully into a chair. My spine still ached from being dragged down the staircase and shoved into the transport van, but the pain no longer controlled the room. Leo stood across from me, ready. I looked at the screens. One folder contained the audio of Thomas and Richard discussing the fraudulent liquidation of the company and the offshore transfer. Another contained the time-stamped video of Richard forging my signature on the bridge loan, followed by Thomas and Richard voluntarily signing the personal guarantor section in their own names. A third folder contained the church donation records showing Ember Digital Media retaining half of Emily's charity collections. Another held the recording of the psychiatrist accepting Richard's cash envelope and agreeing to prepare language for an emergency conservatorship petition. The largest folder belonged to Thomas. Inside were the falsified pension statements, the missing $3 million from client retirement accounts, the cryptocurrency routing records, and the threats from the illegal gambling syndicate. Leo had also preserved the original message headers and transaction logs. There would be no plausible way for Thomas to explain them as a misunderstanding. I stared at the evidence for a long moment. 15 days earlier, I had believed my greatest pain was an empty chair beside my hospital bed. I had been wrong. The empty chair was only the first symptom. The disease was everything now glowing on those screens. Leo placed his fingers over the keyboard. William says the federal contacts are ready. The IRS package is ready. The state bar package is ready. Once I send them, we cannot pull any of it back. That was exactly why I had waited. I had allowed my children to believe the house, the company, and even my legal identity were within reach. I had given them opportunity after opportunity to stop. They had answered every opportunity with another crime. I nodded once. Send it. Leo pressed the enter key. The command looked almost insultingly small. One quiet click. Then the screen filled with transmission confirmations. The first encrypted evidence package went to the federal investigators, already monitoring the financial transfers. It included the attempted company sale, the interstate and international wire instructions, the forged documents, the personal guarantees, and the recorded conspiracy. The second package went to the Internal Revenue Service investigators responsible for financial crimes. Emily's charity payment records were attached beside the corresponding donation logs. The numbers were brutally simple. Money had entered under the name of a charitable campaign, and half had been diverted through her private company. The third package went to the state attorney disciplinary authorities. Richard's forged signature video was there. So was the cash payment to the psychiatrist and the request for manufactured language supporting emergency conservatorship. Thomas's pension records were transmitted with the federal package as a separate financial fraud file. The psychiatrist's bribery recording was included in both the federal and state submissions. Within less than a minute, years of arrogance had been converted into evidence in the hands of institutions my children could not bully at a dinner table. Leo leaned back from the keyboard. It is done. I felt no rush of celebration. There was only silence. The kind of silence that comes after a surgeon makes the first irreversible cut. My encrypted phone vibrated on the table. William's message contained only 4 words. Packages received. Stay ready. I stood and walked slowly toward the window. Far below, traffic moved along the river as if nothing had happened. My children were somewhere across the city, preparing for Sarah and Greg's lavish vow renewal at the Oak Brook Country Club. They had refused to cancel it, even after the collapse of the $10 million sale. Appearance was oxygen to them. If they stopped pretending to be wealthy for even one night, they would have to admit they were drowning. That made the country club the perfect place for the consequences to arrive. By late afternoon, Leo and I were inside a discreet hotel sitting room, watching the first responses come in. Richard's came first. A secure notice from the state disciplinary authority had been delivered to his legal email account. Because the submitted evidence showed an immediate risk involving forgery client trust and attempted manipulation of a vulnerable adult, his authorization to practice was placed under emergency suspension pending formal proceedings. Leo turned the laptop toward me. He will have received that on his phone. Almost on cue, one of the mirrored message feeds lit up. Richard, what did you do? Thomas, what are you talking about? Richard, my license is suspended, effective immediately. Sarah, stop texting this here. We are about to start photographs. Emily, are you serious? Richard, they have video. The thread went silent for nearly 30 seconds. Then Thomas's private phone registered a new incoming message from the gambling syndicate. Account frozen. Your money is not moving. You promised payment. Prepare to pay another way. Thomas did not answer. A second message arrived. Friday was your last warning. Leo's face tightened as he read it. I reached over and closed that window. The federal investigators had frozen the accounts connected to the suspicious transfers. Thomas had spent weeks believing my company would save him from the people he owed. Now both exits were closing at once. A new alert appeared from Sarah's credit card account. Transaction declined. Then another. Transaction declined. The charges were coming from the country club. Flowers, catering, additional champagne service. Sarah had built an extravagant vow renewal on credit she no longer possessed. A minute later, the family group chat exploded. Sarah, WHO froze the card. Greg, mine is declining too. Sarah, call the bank. Greg, I am. Emily, my business card just got blocked. Richard, stop using cards. Do not move any money. They may be tracing everything. Thomas, I need cash now. Sarah, we are surrounded by 200 guests. Fix it. The panic was beginning exactly where the outline of their perfect life was most visible. At the country club, however, they did not stop the ceremony. They could not. Leo accessed the venue's exterior security feed through the network credentials Williams' team had lawfully obtained for our event evidence setup. On the screen, I watched Sarah stand near a wall of white orchids while a photographer adjusted her train. Her smile appeared fixed in place. Greg moved between staff members pretending nothing was wrong, though he checked his phone every few seconds. Richard arrived 10 minutes later. Even through a silent camera feed, his fury was obvious. He pulled Thomas into a corridor beside the ballroom and shoved the emergency suspension notice toward his face. Thomas barely looked at it. His attention was trapped on the threatening messages filling his own screen. Emily appeared next, still filming social media clips, as though her charity accounts had not just been forwarded to federal investigators. Their instincts had not changed. When reality became dangerous, they performed harder. I watched them gather near the service hallway where the guests could not see. Leo activated the audio feed. Sarah spoke first. The country club says they need another payment authorization before dessert service. Greg wiped sweat from his forehead. The joint account is locked. Use another bank, Sarah hissed. There is no other bank. Richard stepped between them. Nobody transfers anything. Nobody signs anything. Somebody sent evidence to the bar. They have footage of the office. Thomas grabbed his arm. What footage? The forgery. Thomas stared at him. You said the cameras were internal. I thought they were. Emily's face lost color. What else do they have? Nobody answered. That silence frightened them more than any accusation could have. Thomas's phone vibrated again. He read the new message and turned away from the group. Sarah noticed. What now? Nothing. Thomas. I said nothing. She snatched at the phone. He jerked it away. For the first time, their carefully coordinated conspiracy had no center. Richard could not command them with legal confidence because his license was suspended. Thomas could not promise money because his accounts were frozen. Sarah could not preserve the event because her cards were declining. Emily could not rely on her public image because the charity records were in government hands. Greg had no property left to pledge. Their panic had finally become visible. I turned away from the monitors. It was time. Leo looked at me. Are you sure your back can handle this? I reached for the garment bag hanging beside the bedroom door. For 15 days, everyone had told me what my body could not do. I was finished listening. Inside the bag was the midnight blue power suit I had worn to close the largest land acquisition of my career. Leo had brought it from the private storage locker my children never knew existed. Beside it sat a velvet case containing my real diamond jewelry and a pair of polished heels. I changed slowly. The transformation was not magic. My spine still required care. My movements were measured, but there was an enormous difference between being injured and being helpless, and my children had built their entire criminal plan on pretending those words meant the same thing. When I emerged from the bedroom, Leo looked at me and smiled. There she is. I fastened one earring and looked at my reflection. The confused woman in the wheelchair was gone. The frightened mother begging not to be sent away was gone. The woman staring back at me had built 70 nursery centers, survived recessions, negotiated with hostile lenders, and moved an empire out of reach before 4 spoiled children even realized there was a board on which the game was being played. We left the hotel shortly after sunset. During the drive to Oakbrook, William called through the encrypted line. The federal teams have the evidence, he said. They are coordinating the next steps. Do not interfere with the agents when they arrive. I will not. And Vivian. Yes, do not let Richard provoke you into making this personal. I looked out at the city lights passing across the window. It became personal 15 days ago. Tonight I am making it public. I ended the call. At the country club, guests were still arriving beneath the covered entrance. Luxury cars lined the drive. The building glowed with warm, light-polished glass and expensive certainty. Leo pulled the Lincoln around to a private side entrance. Before I stepped out, another notification appeared. Richard's emergency suspension had become visible to his firm's internal compliance system. His office access had been revoked. Sarah's primary card had been declined again. Thomas had received another threat. Emily's payment processor had placed a hold on the Ember Digital Media account. 4 separate cracks. 1 collapsing house. Leo slipped his tablet beneath his jacket. He would take control of the ballroom screens when I gave the signal. I rested one hand on the car door. My children believed the worst thing that could happen tonight was public embarrassment. They were about to discover that embarrassment was only the opening act. The grand ballroom at the Oakbrook Country Club was a staggering monument to elite privilege and carefully curated exclusivity. Tonight it had been entirely hijacked by a spectacular display of stolen illusions. Sarah had spared absolutely no expense for her lavish 15-year vow renewal ceremony. Towering centerpieces of rare imported white orchids dominated every single table. Waiters in crisp black tuxedo jackets glided silently across the polished marble floor, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and glasses of premium vintage champagne. A professional string quartet played a delicate classical arrangement in the corner, providing an elegant, sophisticated soundtrack to what was fundamentally a massive impending financial funeral. I stood quietly just outside the heavy double oak doors of the main ballroom. I listened to the muffled overlapping sounds of high society mingling and celebrating a lie. Beside me, Leo tapped a few final, precise commands into his encrypted tablet. He had seamlessly bypassed the country club's wireless network and fully hijacked their central audiovisual system 20 minutes ago. Through the narrow crack between the heavy wooden doors, I watched my family bask in their fraudulent glory. Sarah was standing on the elevated main stage, bathed in flattering, warm spotlighting. She was wearing a custom silk gown that likely cost more than a luxury vehicle, laughing brightly as she posed for the hired event photographer. Greg stood beside her, his smile tight and heavily forced, completely unaware that his short-term shadow loans had already catastrophically defaulted. Emily was circling the stage with her smartphone, broadcasting the extravagant luxury to her internet followers. Richard and Thomas were holding court near the private bar, clinking their whiskey glasses with local politicians, prominent real estate developers, and wealthy socialites. They were standing at the absolute peak of their imaginary mountain. It was the perfect altitude for a fatal drop. I placed my hand flat against the cool, polished wood of the ballroom door. For the past 15 days, I had played the role of a broken, senile, easily discarded old woman. I had let my shoulders slump. I had let my voice tremble. I had allowed them to drag me out of my own home and abandon me at a miserable state facility. I had stripped away every ounce of my formidable pride just to give them enough rope to hang themselves. But that pathetic, trembling character was dead. She had served her purpose. I pushed the heavy oak doors open. They swung inward with a loud, dramatic groan that cut through the polite chatter of the room. I did not shuffle. I did not limp. I walked into the grand ballroom with the rigid, perfectly aligned posture of a billionaire chief executive who had spent 40 years crushing ruthless corporate competitors. I was wearing a sharply tailored midnight blue Tom Ford power suit. A pair of flawless emerald-cut diamond earrings rested against my jawline. My silver hair was swept back in an immaculate, elegant twist. I wore a pair of dark, polished designer heels that clicked against the marble floor with the steady, rhythmic cadence of a ticking metronome. I projected an aura of absolute terrifying sovereignty. The transformation was so jarring, so completely undeniable, that the entire ballroom seemed to freeze in time. The string quartet hit a discordant note and stopped playing altogether. The polite, wealthy conversations died instantly, replaced by a wave of hushed, confused whispers rippling through the crowd of elite guests. The sea of wealthy attendees instinctively parted down the middle, creating a wide, unobstructed path leading directly toward the main stage. On the elevated platform, Sarah was right in the middle of plunging a silver serving knife into a massive 5-tier fondant cake. When she looked up and saw me striding down the center aisle, all the blood completely drained from her face. Her jaw dropped open. Her manicured fingers went entirely slack. The heavy silver knife slipped right out of her hand, plunging down and hitting the polished wooden stage with a loud, sharp clatter. Richard and Thomas froze halfway through their expensive whiskey drinks. They stared at me with wide, horrified eyes, looking exactly like two men who had just seen a ghost walk out of a freshly dug grave. Emily lowered her smartphone, her mouth hanging open in pure, unadulterated shock. I walked past the tables of stunned politicians and wealthy developers, keeping my gaze locked exclusively on my 4 children. I did not look angry. I did not look vindictive. I looked completely, terrifyingly calm. I reached the steps of the elevated stage and climbed them with fluid, effortless grace, utterly destroying the narrative that I was physically and mentally broken. The panic finally broke through Richard's paralysis. His survival instincts kicked in, and he immediately tried to spin the narrative, falling back on the cruel lie he had carefully constructed over the past 2 weeks. Security! Richard shouted, his voice cracking with desperate, high-pitched panic as he rushed toward the edge of the stage. Someone call the venue security right now. My mother has escaped from her medical care facility. She is suffering from severe advanced dementia. She does not know where she is. She is completely confused and highly dangerous. A few of the guests gasped, murmuring in polite concern. Two uniformed security guards stationed near the kitchen doors began to step forward, looking hesitant and unsure of how to handle the beautifully dressed woman standing on the stage. I did not back down. I did not raise my voice in a frantic defense. I simply walked directly over to the hired master of ceremonies, who was standing frozen near the 5-tier cake. I reached out and firmly plucked the wireless microphone right out of his trembling hand. I turned to face the crowd of hundreds of wealthy, influential guests. "I assure you all, my mind has never been sharper than it is at this exact moment," I said. My voice echoed through the massive ballroom speakers, steady, deep, and dripping with lethal authority. The security guards immediately stopped in their tracks, completely subdued by my commanding tone. I turned my gaze slowly, locking eyes with Richard, then Thomas, then Sarah, and finally Emily. My children have spent the last 15 days telling anyone who would listen that my cognitive faculties have entirely failed. I continued pacing slowly across the stage. They claimed I was a confused, helpless burden who needed to be locked away in a chemical prison for my own safety. But they did not commit me to a ward out of maternal concern. They did it because a conscious, capable mother was a massive inconvenience to their criminal ambitions. Richard lunged forward, his face flushed an alarming shade of crimson red. "Turn her microphone off!" he screamed at the audiovisual booth at the back of the room. "Cut the power right now. She is having a psychotic break." But the audiovisual booth was no longer controlled by the country club staff. It was entirely controlled by Leo. Instead of cutting my microphone, Leo hit a command on his tablet. The lights in the grand ballroom instantly dimmed, plunging the wealthy audience into dramatic shadows. The massive high-definition LED screens mounted on the walls behind the stage suddenly flared to life, illuminating the entire room with glaring, undeniable evidence. I gestured gracefully toward the giant screens. "Let me show you exactly what my loving children have been doing while I was recovering from spinal surgery," I announced, my voice cutting through the silent room like a freshly sharpened blade. The first document flashed across the massive screens in brilliant, undeniable clarity. It was the formal cancellation notice from the foreign investment conglomerate terminating the $10 million acquisition of the Hayes Botanical Group. Right beside it, a heavily highlighted legal demand letter appeared. My eldest sons. Thomas and Richard decided to fraudulently sell my corporate empire to fund their lavish lifestyles, I explained, walking right up to where Thomas was standing paralyzed on the stage. Unfortunately for them, the buyer they thought they were selling to was actually controlled by my own trust. I terminated their fraudulent sale before the balance could ever clear, which means the extremely aggressive, high-interest bridge loan they took out against that pending sale is now in catastrophic default. Thomas let out a ragged, choking gasp, stumbling backward as if I had physically struck him. The screen shifted, bringing up the second, far more devastating piece of evidence. It was the $8 million commercial equipment loan contract. One highlighted section showed Richard's forged version of my signature. Another zoomed in on Thomas and Richard's genuine signatures on the personal guarantor lines. Because my brilliant, legally educated sons were too arrogant to read the fine print, I continued, my voice echoing over the stunned crowd, they voluntarily bypassed their corporate liability shields. They are currently personally on the hook for $12 million in immediately payable toxic debt. The commercial lenders are seizing their luxury homes, their investment portfolios, and their bank accounts as we speak. They are entirely bankrupt. The crowd of elite guests erupted into shocked, horrified whispers. Several prominent real estate developers, who had been shaking hands with Richard just 10 minutes ago, physically backed away from him, treating him like he was suddenly highly contagious. The LED screens flashed again. This time it displayed a formal, heavily stamped document from the State Bar Association. "Richard, your career as a defense attorney relies on your reputation for ethical compliance," I noted, turning my cold gaze onto my second son. "Forging my signature on commercial debt contracts is a severe offense." I forwarded the time-stamped video and the bribery evidence to the state disciplinary authorities earlier today. "Your license has been placed under emergency suspension pending formal proceedings. You cannot practice law tonight." Richard dropped to his knees right there on the stage. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a raw, guttural sob of absolute ruin. I was not finished. The screen shifted a final time. It displayed the banking ledgers from Ember Digital Media directly side by side with the donation logs from the Grace Fellowship Youth Ministry. "And my youngest daughter, Emily," I said, pointing the microphone directly at her trembling figure. She utilized my fabricated terminal illness to extract charitable donations from a local church congregation, routing 50% of those funds through her private company. The Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation received her complete banking ledgers earlier today. Emily dropped her smartphone. It hit the stage and shattered. She covered her mouth violently, hyperventilating as the wealthy church members in the audience stared at her with pure, unfiltered disgust. The entire ballroom was vibrating with the shockwave of their total systematic destruction. My children were completely exposed, stripped of their wealth, their prestige and their freedom entirely ruined in front of the exact high society peers they had tried so desperately to impress. I stood in the center of the stage, towering over the broken, sobbing remnants of my own family. I held the microphone close, ensuring my final words would echo in their minds for the rest of their miserable lives. "You all sat in my living room and declared that I was a weak, senile old woman," I said, my voice dropping into a lethal, terrifying calm. "You threw me out of my own home like garbage. But I was never confused. I was never losing my mind. I simply pretended to be weak just to see exactly how profoundly rotten you could become. You wanted my empire, but all you inherited was the destruction of your own lives." I dropped the microphone. It hit the wooden stage with a heavy final thud. I turned my back on them and walked slowly, elegantly toward the exit. The heavy wooden doors of the grand ballroom had barely swung shut behind me when the shrill, unmistakable wail of approaching sirens pierced the quiet suburban night. I stood in the opulent marble lobby of the country club, adjusting the cuffs of my midnight blue suit. Through the towering floor-to-ceiling glass windows I watched as a fleet of dark, unmarked tactical vehicles and local police cruisers swarmed the pristine circular driveway. Brilliant flashes of red and blue emergency lights began to strobe violently across the manicured landscaping. The vibrant colors cut through the darkness, casting eerie, shifting shadows across the terrified faces of the high society guests who were now pressing themselves against the ballroom glass. I did not move toward the exit right away. I wanted to witness the absolute, undeniable conclusion of the war they had started. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, marched through the main entrance. They moved with a terrifying coordinated efficiency, completely ignoring the protests of the bewildered country club manager. Local police officers flanked them, their hands resting cautiously on their heavy-duty utility belts. The authorities bypassed the luxury coat check and the champagne reception area, pushing the heavy ballroom doors wide open. I stood quietly in the shadows of the mezzanine balcony, looking down at the spectacular ruin of my own flesh and blood. The federal agents fanned out across the room, completely surrounding the main stage where my 4 children were still frozen in absolute shock. The wealthy politicians, prominent real estate developers, and elite socialites practically climbed over each other to back away from the center of the room. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a federal raid. My children were completely isolated on an island of their own catastrophic making. Richard was the first to break the paralysis. The disgraced corporate attorney desperately raised his hands, stepping forward with a pathetic, trembling attempt at legal authority. He opened his mouth, likely preparing to spout some technical defense about jurisdictional rights or procedural errors. The lead federal agent did not even let him finish drawing his breath. He grabbed Richard by the shoulder, spun him around roughly, and slammed his chest against the polished wooden surface of the stage. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the silent ballroom was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 15 days. Richard Hayes, the agent, announced, his voice booming with undeniable legal authority. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and grand larceny. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." Sarah let out a blood-curdling, hysterical scream. She dropped to her knees, completely ruining her custom silk vow renewal gown on the frosting-covered floor. A federal agent stepped directly toward her and ordered her hands behind her back. Sarah stared at him in disbelief, insisting that she had only been protecting the family. The agent secured steel cuffs around her wrists and informed her that she was under arrest for her role in the conspiracy. Greg stood several feet away, pale and shaking as investigators separated him for questioning about the attempted property transfer and his financial records. Thomas was completely paralyzed. The eldest son, the man who had confidently signed away his entire life to cover his degenerate gambling debts, simply stared blankly at the federal badge being shoved into his face. When the agent grabbed his wrists and pulled them behind his back, Thomas let out a soft, broken whimper that sounded exactly like a terrified child. It was a stark, pathetic contrast to the arrogant predator who had casually discussed locking me in a miserable state-run dementia ward. Emily was the loudest of them all. The disgraced social media influencer thrashed and kicked violently as a female officer attempted to read her the Miranda rights. Emily screamed that she was a public figure, that her reputation was being destroyed, and that her online followers would demand justice. The officer simply secured the handcuffs tighter, hauling my youngest daughter to her feet, with zero sympathy for her ruined aesthetic. As the agents began marching them down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, parading them like captured criminals in front of the exact high society peers they had tried so desperately to impress, Richard suddenly looked up. His desperate, searching eyes found me standing perfectly still on the shadowed mezzanine balcony. "Mom!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated terror. "Mom, please, tell them it is a misunderstanding. You have the money. You can fix this. You can hire the best defense lawyers in the state. Please do not let them take us away." Sarah and Emily immediately joined the frantic chorus, their tear-streaked faces contorted in absolute desperation. They begged for my mercy. They pleaded for my maternal protection. They cried out that we were family, that they loved me, that they were simply confused and made a terrible mistake. I looked down at the 4 people I had brought into this world. I looked at the children I had nurtured, funded, and protected for my entire adult life. I searched the deepest, most quiet corners of my own heart, looking for even a single ounce of pity, a single shred of maternal guilt, or a fleeting urge to save them from their self-inflicted destruction. The vault of my heart was completely empty. There was absolutely nothing left for them. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply looked at Richard, maintaining an expression of absolute freezing indifference. I slowly turned my back on the pathetic, sobbing group of felons. I walked away from the balcony railing, stepping smoothly out the side exit doors and into the crisp, refreshing winter night. I climbed into the back of the waiting black Lincoln town car, where Leo was sitting quietly in the driver's seat. I instructed him to drive us home, leaving my children to the cold, unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system. 6 months later, the bright morning sun poured through the massive wraparound glass windows of my downtown executive office. I stood perfectly straight, my hands resting lightly on the polished mahogany windowsill, looking out over the sprawling, beautiful Chicago skyline. The painful titanium screws in my lumbar spine had fully integrated with the bone. The agonizing daily physical therapy sessions had paid off in spectacular fashion. I was entirely wonderfully healed. I moved with a fluid, effortless grace that I had not felt in years. The heavy, stifling weight of betrayal had been completely lifted from my shoulders, replaced by an invigorating sense of absolute freedom and sovereign power. The legal aftermath of the country club raid was swift and merciless. Thomas, Richard, Sarah, and Emily all faced federal cases built from the recordings, forged documents, financial transfers, and their own messages. By 6 months later, each of my 4 children had either entered a federal plea or been convicted on charges tied to the conspiracy and related financial crimes. Richard's emergency suspension became a permanent professional collapse. Thomas's pension victims were placed at the center of the restitution process. Emily's charity scheme destroyed the influencer empire she had protected more fiercely than her own family. Sarah lost the social standing she had treated like oxygen. Greg separately was drowning in bankruptcy proceedings and legal exposure connected to his debts and his attempt to seize the Lake Geneva property. A soft, polite knock at the heavy glass door of my office pulled me from my reflections. "Come in," I said, turning away from the breathtaking city view. The heavy glass door swung open. Leo stepped into the executive suite. The transformation of my grandson over the past 6 months had been nothing short of miraculous. The nervous, introverted teenager, hiding in dark, oversized hoodies, was completely gone. In his place stood a sharp, incredibly confident young man wearing a meticulously tailored charcoal gray suit. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm, projecting an aura of quiet, reliable intelligence. "Good morning, Grandma," Leo said, offering a warm, genuine smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "The finalized transition documents for the new commercial acquisitions are completely prepped and waiting for your review. The holding company in Zurich officially cleared the operating capital an hour ago." I walked across the spacious office and stood in front of my massive mahogany desk. I did not sit down. I simply opened the top drawer and pulled out a small, heavy velvet box. I handed it across the polished surface to my grandson. Leo took the box carefully. He popped the lid open. Resting on the dark satin interior was a solid antique brass key, accompanied by a heavy embossed corporate identification card. Leo looked down at the brass key, and then his eyes widened as he read the golden lettering printed on the identification card. Vice President of Operations, Hayes Botanical Group. He looked up at me, completely, stunned, his mouth slightly open. "Grandma, I cannot accept this. I am still finishing my degree. I do not have the executive experience to run a division this massive." I reached out and gently placed my hand over his. "You have something far more valuable than a traditional business degree, Leo. You have absolute integrity. You have a brilliant strategic mind. And most importantly, you know exactly how to protect the people you care about when the wolves come circling. You saved my life, my legacy, and my company. You are going to learn the commercial real estate business directly from me, and when I am finally ready to step down, this entire empire will belong to you." Leo closed the velvet box. He gripped it tightly in his hand, his eyes shining with profound, overwhelming gratitude. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me in a fierce, loving embrace. I hugged him back tightly, resting my chin against his shoulder, feeling the deep, unbreakable bond of a truly chosen family. After Leo left the office to prepare the morning briefing, I walked back over to the towering glass windows. I looked down at the busy, bustling city streets far below. Millions of people were rushing to work, building their lives, trusting their families, completely unaware of how quickly the people you love can turn into absolute monsters. Cutting off the children you carried in your own body is the most profound, unnatural pain a mother can ever experience. It defies every biological instinct we are given. You spend your entire life building a safe harbor for them, convinced that your unconditional love will shape them into good, decent people. You excuse their flaws, you fund their mistakes, you blindly hope that they will eventually find their moral compass. But sometimes the blood running through your family tree turns toxic. Sometimes the children you raised transform into a vicious, aggressive cancer that threatens to devour everything you have built. And when a malignant tumor threatens to kill the host, you cannot negotiate with it. You cannot love it away. You cannot buy its loyalty. You have to pick up a surgical blade and you have to cut it out completely. You have to remove it by the roots and throw it into the incinerator before it consumes you alive. Some people in my social circle whispered behind my back. They called me ruthless. They called me a cold, unnatural mother for turning my own children over to the federal authorities and letting them rot in prison cells. They judged me for stripping away their wealth and handing my entire corporate empire to a 19-year-old boy. But I simply look at them, and I wonder how they would react if they were forced to endure the absolute darkness of my reality. I look at you and I ask you the exact same thing. Imagine waking up in agonizing pain after a major surgery, surrounded by the terrifying, deafening silence of an empty hospital room for 15 days. Imagine discovering that the children you sacrificed everything for were actively plotting to steal your life savings, destroy your company, and lock you in a miserable chemical prison until you died. Imagine watching them laugh and drink your champagne while treating you like a piece of worthless garbage to be discarded. If the people you loved and trusted most in this world abandoned you to die in the dark, and you finally found the strength to stand up and fight back, would you show them mercy? Or would you be absolutely unapologetically ruthless?